What if Bellatrix Lestrange raised baby Harry inside her Azkaban cell? A dark canon what if, in 7 chapters Chapter 1 the forged file Azkaban does not have weather. Azkaban has only the absence of it, the long, salt-shocked corridor that the wind has been hollowing out of the North Sea since before any wizard thought to build a prison there, and the cold that comes with it, which is not the cold of winter but the cold of accounting. Cold like a ledger. Cold like a name written in a thin clerk's hand, and crossed out the next morning. On the night of November 1, 1981, the cold in the women's wing was filing itself one corridor at a time, indifferent and methodical, and the Dementors were moving along with it the way ink moves along a quill, without urgency, without sound, with the small permanent inhalations of a thing that has been doing the same job for 900 years and has not yet decided to stop. A man came up the stair carrying a baby. He had not slept. You could tell by the way he held the bundle. A rested Auror carries a child the way he carries a hand-warmer, with one arm bent at a defensive angle, the other free for his wand. A tired man holds a child the way a tired man holds anything, which is to say close to the chest, with the wand hand forgotten and resting on the railing. This man was tired in a way that wasn't only tonight's tiredness. He had been tired since the Longbottoms, perhaps, possibly since the Prewetts, certainly since he had been told, 3 hours ago in a sub-basement of the Ministry, exactly what he was going to do tonight, and exactly what he was going to say, on his honor as an Auror of the Crown, that he had done. He was 41 years old, and he had agreed to die in his sleep within the month. The mark on his forearm did not show under his sleeve. He had washed it, on the off chance, with salt and rosewater and a brief vile thing he had been taught it in bulk by a woman whose face he no longer remembered. He still felt it. It was the only warm thing in him. The baby was asleep. It had been a long crossing. The North Sea slapandrol had eventually defeated the small, disgruntled crying that had filled the boat from Wick to the island, and the child had taken its thumb and folded itself into a shape that was almost the shape of a child sleeping, and was actually the shape of a child who has decided very early that crying produces nothing. There was a thin red lightning shape on the forehead. The blood had been washed off. The wound underneath had already begun to be a scar, which is the way a thing earned on October 31 becomes the way it earns its keep on November 1, and that is the law of Halloween and the law of the cradle. And the Auror, who could read both, looked away when his eyes touched it. He had a slip of paper in his breast pocket. He could feel its corner against the inside of his sternum. The slip said, in the cramped triangular script of a clerk who did not exist anymore, Subject, Minor M, 15 Mo, orphan of A and L Potter, deceased 31/10/81. Petunia Dursley, next of kin, Muggle, refused intake. Authority, Section 12b, Magical Orphans Act, 1937, subsection Roman 7, refusal of Muggle kin, disposition, Azkaban transfer custody, female ward indefinite under guardianship of Lestrange, B, Cell 14, authorizing signature, Bagnold M, Minister. Time of authorization, 3/14/31/10/81. Every line of it was a lie. There was no Section 12b subsection, Roman 7. The Magical Orphans Act of 1937 stopped at subsection Roman 6, and Roman 6 said that any orphan whose Muggle kin refused intake was to be referred to the Magical Foundling Office in Diagon Alley, where the Weasleys, last he had heard, had quietly volunteered to take the boy, the Weasleys taking everything quietly that way, like grass. Petunia Dursley had not refused intake. Petunia Dursley had been in Surrey all evening, watching a small black-and-white television set and a small black-and-white husband, and had not received a letter, an owl, or so much as a knock. The signature at the bottom of the slip was a forgery executed in a Slytherin common room in 1973 by a boy who had since died, and the time of authorization, 3/14, was a small private joke on the part of the man who had drafted it. Pi to 2 decimal places. The man who had drafted it had been clever in school. Cleverness, the Auror thought dully, was what got you a mark. He climbed. The stairs were limestone and frost. Each step rang once and was eaten by the corridor before the next. Behind him, 4 Dementors paced him at the precise distance their instructions required, and the air around them was thick the way silence is thick before a confession. He kept his mind on the slip of paper. He kept his mind on the slip of paper, because if he let his mind off the slip of paper for one breath, the Dementors would find what was under it, which was a name, which was Lily, which was the green-colored fact that he had loved her in 5th year and never told anyone, including her, and had spent the next 11 years writing the kind of small, useful, disloyal report that ends in a green-colored fact in a hallway in Godric's Hollow. The slip of paper was a better thing to think about. The slip of paper was a piece of forged white card with a forged purple ministry stamp, and he could keep his mind on it the way a man at a tiled urinal keeps his mind on the tile. Cell 14 was at the end of the corridor on the 2nd tier of the women's wing, which was not the deepest tier, but was the cell whose occupant had been logged on October 28 as containing a witch who could no longer be put on the deeper tier without committing a slow and unbillable murder. The Lestranges had been brought in together on the 14th, screaming. They had been separated on the 16th, because Rodolphus had attempted on the 15th to bite through his own wrists with the apparent intention of bleeding to death with his shoulder against the wall of his wife's cell, so that what dripped through the stone would reach her. Rabastan had been put on the men's tier, 4th row. Bellatrix had been put on the women's tier, 2nd row, cell 14, on a recommendation by the healer that she be kept where she could be observed by rotation. By the morning of the 17th, she had stopped screaming and started singing, and by the morning of the 18th, the healer had stopped writing recommendations. The aura reached the cell. He stood for a moment, breathing through his teeth, and let his eyes get used to the dim. The cell was lit by what Azkaban called dim and what most people called dark, a fish-belly gray that came from nowhere and pooled along the floor. There was a wooden bench bolted into one wall and an iron drain bolted into the floor. There was a woman in the back corner. She was sitting on her heels with her hands open in her lap, palms up, the way one sits when one has been told to sit and has obeyed because obeying is funny. And her hair, which she had been famous for in the right pages of the right magazines 6 years ago, hung over her face in 2 black ropes. He could not see her eyes. He could see the breath move in her shoulders, which were thin in the way that shoulders become thin when the body decides to lay off non-essential muscle and keep the heart. She had been 10 weeks in this cell. She looked like she had been here for the length of a war. He took a breath, and he said, in the voice that an aura is trained to use, "Lestrange, Bellatrix, by order of the minister, you are to receive into your custody and ward indefinite the following minor." He found that he could not say the name. He found in the small clearing between the Dementors and the cell that the name would not come out of his throat. He said instead, "Male, 15 months, orphan." She lifted her head. She did not lift it all the way. She lifted it as much as a person lifts a head when she is interested in something for the first time in 3 weeks, and her eyes, he saw them now between the ropes of her hair, were not the eyes the aura had been warned about. He had been warned about black and burning. He had been warned about Crucio eyes, the particular hot, wet shine of a witch who had stood in the Longbottom's parlor for 40 minutes and watched what she had made happen. He had not been warned that those same eyes, in a cell with no wand, could go gray. Could go the gray of a piece of slate that someone has wept onto and the rain has scrubbed since. She looked at the baby. She looked at it for the time it took the aura to remember that he was supposed to be saying something. She looked at it for the time it took his mouth to be dry. She looked at it the way a woman who has been told that her own womb is empty forever and is the rumored architect of that emptiness looks at a child. She looked at it, and the aura thought, with the small, terrified clarity that came over him sometimes when he was forgetting Lily on purpose, that he had been told by the Dark Lord, by the man, the thing, the long, pale presence, by the voice, that Bellatrix Lestrange would kill any child placed in her cell within the first hour. The Dark Lord had said, "She will tear it open with her hands, and they will find it in the morning." The Dark Lord had been pleased with this prediction. The Dark Lord had laughed in his terrible glass-thin way and said, "She will do it for me." And the slip of paper had been written, and the boat from Wick had been arranged, and the aura had crossed in the cold with the bundle, and now he was standing at the door of cell 14, and he was watching Bellatrix Lestrange look at the baby. She said, after a long time, in a voice that was very quiet, "Whose?" It was not a question with a mark on the end of it. It was the bare consonant of the word, dropped onto the flagstone like a coin. The Auror started to speak the lie and found again that his throat would not produce the name. He thought about going back down the stairs. He thought about the boat. He thought about Wick. He said instead, Potter. She did not move. She did not blink. The 2 ropes of her hair did not stir. Somewhere down the corridor, a Dementor turned, and the cold turned with it. He had a moment in which he believed she would lunge, that the thing he had been told would happen would now happen, and he would set the baby on the flagstone and step back and watch, and the Dark Lord would be pleased. And he found, looking at her face, that he did not want it to happen, and he had not known until this moment that he did not want it to happen, and the not wanting felt like the first warm thing in him in 9 days. She said, "Open the door." He opened the door. She said, "Set him down on the bench, not the floor, the bench." He set him down on the bench. The baby slept on. He had been very tired. The North Sea had defeated him. She said, "Now get out of my cell." He got out of her cell. He locked the door. He stood for a moment in the corridor with his hand on the bars, and he found that he could not look in. He found that his eyes were full. He found that the slip of paper in his breast pocket was a tongue against his sternum. He found that he had not, in fact, been an Auror since 5th year, when he had begun to love Lily Evans and to keep small notes about her habits and to forward them in the small intervals between defense against the dark arts and his own slow, careful destruction. And that he had been many things between then and now, and that none of them had been an Auror, and that perhaps that was the worst of it, that the world had thought he was an Auror, when he had only ever been a clerk. He walked back down the stairs. The Dementors went with him. He went back across the water. He never returned to file the paperwork. By the time the slip of paper crossed the Pomeroy Bridge in the rain on the morning of November 3, it had been already. By the careful arrangement of the boy who had died at Hogwarts in 1973, Mies routed to a file in the Department of Mysteries marked Deceased Infants, where it would sit unopened for 10 years and 4 months, indexed under the wrong forename, signed by a minister who would never see it, authorized at a time that was a joke and a number, and the corner of which would, eventually, be eaten by a silverfish. The Auror went home. He drank for a week. He took the position the Dark Lord had promised him in a department of the ministry that he was not, in fact, qualified to enter. He drowned in his bath on the night of November 22, alone, on his own kitchen floor, having vomited a small clear quantity of something that an exhumation would find, 8 years later, to contain enough doxicide to drop a horse. The exhumation was filed under suicide, drunkard, and was not pursued. By that time, there was no one left in the ministry who knew his name. The boy who had drafted the slip of paper was dead. The mark on his forearm had faded to a small gray bruise. He was buried in the Auror Cemetery at Mortlake with full honors, having served, the headstone said, the crown and the realm with distinction for 19 years. The grass grew. The salt cold of Azkaban that had soaked into his coat that night came off in the wash and stayed in his wife's laundry basket for a fortnight, smelling faintly of fish. These are the small bureaucratic facts. They are not the story. The story is what happened inside cell 14 after the door had closed. The cell was 8 feet by 10. The bench was 3 feet long. The drain was a hole. The baby on the bench was 15 months old and weighed 26 pounds and had been swaddled in the kind of gray wool blanket that the Auror office stocked in case of a child being found in a raid, and the blanket smelled of pipe smoke. The cell smelled of the sea, which is the smell that everything in Azkaban smells of in the end, the long pickled smell of brine and iron and the hair of women who have been left. Bellatrix Lestrange did not move. She sat on her heels in the back corner of the cell, and she looked at the baby on the bench. There was a window in the cell, 6 inches by 6, a square punched through 3 feet of stone, and the moon, which had been full on the 31st, was rolling off to one side, and a finger of moonlight came in through the window and rested on the bench beside the baby's foot. The foot was very small. It was inside a sock. The sock had a stripe. The blanket had ridden up. She could see the sock and the stripe. The Dementors moved in the corridor outside, 4 of them, breathing without breath, and the cold poured along the floor like a slow, flat water, and the woman in the corner did not move. She watched. She watched for an hour. She watched for 2 hours. She watched for 3. The baby slept on. Once, in the second hour, he turned in his sleep and pushed his fist against his cheek, and her hands in her lap made a single involuntary spasm and stopped. She did not blink. She watched. She was thinking, although thinking was the wrong word for what Bellatrix Lestrange did in the second month of her sentence. In the same way that bleeding is the wrong word for what a corpse does when you turn it over, she was thinking, somewhere under the long pearl-gray shawl of grief that had been laid over her brain on the 2nd of November when the news of her lord had come in through the bars. She was thinking that the baby was Potter, and that the lord had been undone by a Potter, and that this was the kind of thing a person did, perhaps, with a baby that had undone a lord, tore it open, and used what came out and was hailed in the morning. She was thinking that her fingernails were long enough now, after 10 weeks without trimming, to do what was needed. She was thinking that there was a drain in the floor. She was thinking that there was a healer on the second tier who would write the report in the way that suited everyone. She was thinking these things, in the second hour, with the soft, attentive part of her mind that did her thinking now that the loud part of her mind had been carried away with the bringing of the news. Then she was thinking, in the third hour, about her aunt. She had not thought about her aunt in 15 years. Her aunt had been her mother's elder sister, Walpurga's sister. Her aunt had been Drula Rosier before she married, and Drula Rosier after she married, because the Rosiers did not, in the old fashion, let go of a name when a man took it, and Drula Rosier Black had taken Bellatrix at 5½ and held her on the wide grey lap of her petticoats and taught her the first incantation Bellatrix had ever cast, and the incantation had been the lullaby. There was a black lullaby. There was a Rosier lullaby. The lullabies were different, and Drula had taught the black one because Bellatrix's mother had refused. Bellatrix's mother had taken the position, in 1956, that lullabies were a sentimentality fit for the lesser branches. Bellatrix's mother had been a woman who pronounced sentimentality with 3 syllables and never the same 3 twice. Drula had taken the child and sat on the petticoats and sung. The incantation was 12 bars long. It was sung in a low voice. It was an incantation in the same way that any old song sung over a sleeping body in a wizarding house is an incantation. It made the child not dream. It made the child grow long. It made the child come back in the night if the child wandered. It was the same shape, Bellatrix knew now, sitting on her heels in cell 14 in November 1981 as a tether. She had not sung it since she was 9. She did not sing it now. But she found in the third hour that her lips had moved once around its opening sound, a low long M, the way the blacks taught their daughters to begin a tether, and that her hands had unclenched in her lap and lay open like a bowl. She watched the baby. She watched the baby for another hour. The fourth hour was the hour in which she discovered that her milk had come down. She did not, at first, understand what she was feeling. She thought, with the long, polished clarity that her madness gave her in those weeks, that she was being haunted. She thought with great satisfaction that she was being possessed by the dead matriarchs of the Black Line, which had always been promised her and never delivered. She thought, finally, with a kind of slow, disbelieving offense, that her own body, the body of Bellatrix Drula Black Lestrange, 29 years old, 9th in succession at the sacred 28, was producing milk for the Potter baby on the bench. She put her hand on her chest, under her ribbed prison shift, and brought her hand away wet and looked at the wet on her hand, and was, for a moment, sane in a way she had not been since the door had closed behind her in October. She said aloud in the empty cell with the 4 Dementors padding past the bars. "Number," she said it the way a woman says it to a husband at the breakfast table, not loud, not asking. The simple flat refusal of a tired, polite person. She said it again. "Number." She got up. She walked to the bench. She stood over the baby. She looked down at him. She looked at the lightning scar on the forehead, and at the sock with the stripe, and at the small fist against the cheek, and at the open mouth, and at the breath going in and out of the open mouth, the small breath of a child who has decided very early that crying produces nothing. She said the third time, "Number." It was thinner than the first 2. It came out, this time, as a word with the air of a question in it. She said it again to remove the question. The question would not come out. The maternal magic in her, long dormant, she had been pregnant once, in the spring of 1979, and had lost it at 13 weeks in a manner not recorded. and the magic had been laid down then in the long-lined cupboards of her body, the way a thing is laid down in the cellar of a house with the expectation of being brought up at the right occasion. The maternal magic surfaced against her will. It came up in her throat. It came up in her chest. It came up between her teeth, and the shape of it was the lullaby, and she did not sing it. She clamped her jaw on it. She set her teeth and ground them once, and the lullaby went sideways into the muscle of her tongue and stayed there, twitching. She knelt. She knelt by the bench beside the baby, and she put her hand very slowly on his small ribs where the breath was going in and out. She held it there. The breath went in and out under her hand. The Dementors went down the corridor, and the Dementors came back. The moon moved. The finger of moonlight on the bench moved with it, slid across the sock, touched the small fist, slid up the cheek, and slid off again into the corner of the cell, leaving the bench in the fish-belly gray. The baby slept on. He had been very tired. She said very quietly, "Potter." She said it the way she might say a word she had been forbidden. Forbidden in the Black House in 1962 by her father. Forbidden in the Lestrange house in 1975 by her husband. Forbidden in the gardens at Malfoy Manor in 1979 by the Lord, in the moment in which the Lord had set out for them, on the long sandalwood table among the apple trees, the great task that was to be theirs in the autumn. She said it now in cell 14 the way she had said other forbidden things, lightly on the tip of her tongue, the way a child says a word to see whether the world will fall in. The world did not fall in. The baby breathed. She unbuttoned the front of her shift. She did not look at her own body. She put the baby to her breast. The baby, who had been very tired, did not at first take. She made the small clicking sound at the back of her tongue that Drula Rosierblack had made for her in 1957, when she had refused to take from a hired witch and had had to be coaxed at her aunt's hand. The sound was a rosier sound. The sound was a tether sound. The baby turned his head and his small clean mouth and opened his eyes for the first time inside cell 14. And his eyes were a green that she had been told about in the briefing and had not, until this moment, believed in. The green was the green of the curse her Lord had taught her in the orchard. The green was the green of an unforgivable cast by a hand that had loved nothing. The green was, also, the green of a glass bottle on a windowsill that has the sun through it in the late afternoon. The baby looked at her with these eyes, and he took. He took for 9 minutes. She knew because Azkaban had been built on a slow room clock, and the clock breathed through the stone in pulses the inmates measured time by. And the pulse was 30 seconds, and she counted the pulses on the front of her teeth, and there were 18 of them, which is 9. And at the end of the 9 minutes the baby came off her, drowsy and milk-mouthed and complete, and turned his face into the crook of her elbow and slept again. And she remained where she was, kneeling beside the bench in the cell, with her shift unbuttoned and her hair in 2 black ropes over her shoulders, and the Dementors a corridor away. And she stayed there until the sun came up. The sun in Azkaban does not come into cell 14. The window faces west. The sun in Azkaban is only the slow gray replacement of the gray of the night by the gray of the day. And on the morning of November 2, 1981, the replacement took its time, and Bellatrix Lestrange knelt beside a bench on which slept the orphan son of James and Lily Potter, with the baby's head in the crook of her elbow and her hand spread flat over his small ribs where the breath was going in and out, and she watched him until the day had finished arriving. When the day had finished arriving, she said, in a voice quite unlike the voices she had been using since her arrest, the voice of a woman speaking to a husband at a breakfast table, "I do not know what I am going to do with you." The baby did not answer. The baby was asleep. She said, "I do not know what I am going to do with you, but I know that I am not going to kill you tonight." The baby did not answer. She said, after another silence, "I will think of it tomorrow." She did not think of it tomorrow. She did not think of it the day after. She thought, instead, in the small accumulating fashion in which a person thinks who has had her loud thinking taken away, about practicalities, about the bench and the blanket and the milk, about the rotation of the guards, which she had been listening to for 10 weeks and had by now memorized, 2 on the night shift and 1 on the day, and the changeover at 6 and at 18, about the Dementors, which were the simplest of the problems and would, if she was honest, not notice the baby at all, since Dementors fed on grief and not on the meat that produced it, and a baby of 15 months has very little grief, having had so little to lose. About the cell, which she had begun on her first night to map in her mind in the way she had mapped, in 1972, the corridors of Hogwarts, and which had 4 loose stones in the floor near the drain and 1 loose stone in the wall near the bench, and a small bracket on the wall above the bench that had once held an oil lamp, and now held nothing about the corridor, about the women in the cells to either side. Who in cell 13 was a McNair, and in cell 15 was a Travers, and would both, she knew, in the way that black women know things, accept what she told them to accept and turn their faces to the wall when they were told to turn them, about the healer, who would visit on the 14th and would be either dealt with or recruited, about the Aura who had brought the baby, who had been a mark and would already be dead by Yule or sooner, about her lord, who was somewhere, she did not yet know exactly where, but somewhere, not dead, because he could not be dead, because she had been promised, about the long way, the impossible way, the very long way that began here in cell 14 with a baby on a bench, and a woman kneeling on the flagstone in the fish-belly gray of an Azkaban morning. She thought about all of these things. She thought about them with the part of her mind that the madness had not eaten. She did not sleep. When the changeover at 6 came, and the boots of a guard rang on the limestone at the corridor's end, she rose from her knees and crossed the cell and bundled the baby in his pipe-smoke blanket and laid him in the space behind the bench, between the wall and the bench leg, where she had been keeping, for 2 weeks, a small private cache of rat bones in case she needed teeth in a hurry, and she covered him with her own gray shawl, and she stood with her back to the bench and her hands in her lap, palms down, the way one stands in a cell when a guard is going past, and the guard went past, and the guard did not look in, and the baby slept on, and Bellatrix Lestrange, 29 years old, of the sacred 28, mother of nothing and aunt of nothing and wife of a man chewing his own wrists in the men's tier, began the long-hidden 11 years of her motherhood. She did not think of it tomorrow. She did not need to. Chapter 2, Prophecy for Blankets. The first thing she stole was a name. She stole it on the morning of November 3, 1981, 2 days into her motherhood, when the rotation guard came past the bars with a tin pail of cold gruel and a tin spoon, and Bellatrix Lestrange, who had not spoken to a guard since her arrest, said in a small, reasonable voice, like a woman ordering tea in a coffee house in Diagon Alley in the second half of an afternoon, "Pass me the pail, please." The guard was a man called Thaddeus Care. He had been a guard at Azkaban for 19 years. He had a wife in Wick and a daughter who was studying charms by correspondence and a small persistent bowel complaint of the kind that comes from being too long in a cold, wet place, and he had not been spoken to as a person in cell 14 ever. He gave her the pail. He did not give it to her with grace. He gave it the way a man gives a thing to an animal that has unexpectedly addressed him in his own language. He said, "What?" she said. "What's your name?" He told her his name. He did not know afterwards why. He had been told in the briefing on his first day at Azkaban that the principal rule of the women's tier was, do not converse, do not respond, do not name. He had been told it again at every annual reminder. He told her his name. It came out the way a button comes off a shirt, in the small, unceremonious way that the simple things come out of a man when his attention is somewhere else, and his attention in that moment was on the cold ringing through the soles of his boots, the cold which always rang harder in cell 14, because cell 14 was at the end of the corridor and the wind came down it from the seaward face. She said, "Thaddeus, thank you. May I ask one more thing of you?" He stood in the corridor with one hand on the bars and the other on the tin pail he had given over. He did not answer. She said in a voice that was clean of all the things that her voice had been since October, "Bring me a blanket." He said, "I can't." She said, "I know." He said, "Why?" She said, "I am cold." He stood there. He shifted his weight from one boot to the other. He had a moment, the kind that came up sometimes in his work, of a strange dislocation, in which he was a man in a corridor in a salt prison being asked by a famous witch for a blanket, and the matter of blanket or no blanket was, for one breath, the only matter in the world. Then the Dementors came around the corner at the end of the corridor, and his attention slid back into his boots, and he said, "I can't," and went on. She said, just before he was out of earshot, "Thaddeus." He stopped. She said into the slot of gray morning that the doorless doorway at the corridor's end had become, "There is a sun, there will be a sun, the 3rd Tuesday of next May." He did not turn around. She said in the same clean voice, "He will live. He will not be a squib. You may name him for your father." She did not say anything else. She put the tin pail down on the flagstone. She buttoned the front of her shift. She sat on her heels in the back corner of the cell with her hands open in her lap. The baby, behind the bench, slept on. The guard in the corridor stood for a long moment and did not turn around and then walked on. He had a wife in Wick. He had a daughter studying charms by correspondence. He had not until that morning said aloud, not to her, not to himself, that the wife in Wick was 3 weeks gone, and that she had said nothing about it to him, having said nothing about 3 of the others before, and that he had been, for a fortnight, dreaming of a child who looked like his father and walked into rivers. He had not, until that morning, known that he had been dreaming this dream. The dream came back to him on the steps down to the day room, and he stood for a moment on the 3rd step from the bottom with his hand on the rail, and he closed his eyes, and he said very quietly to no one in particular, "Mother of God!" He went down. He delivered the rest of the gruel. He drank a cup of weak tea in the day room. At 7 minutes to 9, he went down to the supply room and he took a single grey wool blanket out of the press, and folded it once across his arm, and went back up to the women's tier. And on his second pass of cell 14, in the moment in which the Dementors had drifted by and the corridor was, for a breath, empty, he opened the slot in the bars and pushed the blanket through and walked on and did not look back, and Bellatrix Lestrange did not thank him aloud, because thanking was not part of what they had agreed to, but he heard, as he turned the corner, the small black click at the back of her tongue, which was the sound that her Aunt Drula had taught her in 1957, and which means, in the language of the sacred 28, that a thing has been received and accounted. This was the first transaction. There would be many transactions over the next 11 years, and the principal currency of the transactions would be prophecy. But the currency of the first transaction was a blanket, and the blanket was the foundation of everything. A house, even a cell, needs a foundation. And the foundation of cell 14 was the grey wool blanket folded twice along its long edge, which she laid out behind the bench, where the shadow was deepest, and on which she laid the baby on the second night, and which she covered, that night and every night afterwards, with the threadbare shawl she had been given on her arrest, so that anything looking in from the corridor would see only an old shawl on the flagstone and nothing under it. She slept, after that, on the bench above him, with one hand hanging down into the dark where his breath was, and the breath came in and out under her hand, and she counted the breaths to sleep. She did not in the 2nd week say his name. She did not in the 3rd week give him a new one. She watched him in the day, in the long grey-watered hours between feedings, and she said to him only the small unweighted words a person uses on a child who has not yet attached words to objects: warm, SSH, good, eat, sleep, hush. She said hush most often. She said hush the way a sailor says the name of the wind. She said hush as a charm, and the Dementors went past in the corridor outside, and the baby slept, and the grey ropes of the wool became the walls of a house inside the cell, and the bench became the roof of the house, and the shawl became the door of the house, and the baby grew. He grew in a way that was, by the standard of the world outside, not enough. He was a small child. He had been small to begin with. He had been a Halloween baby, a winter baby, and he was small in the way that Halloween babies are small in the spring. He had been malnourished at the cottage in the fortnight before the curse. He was malnourished now in the cell, despite Bellatrix's milk, which had come down for the first 3 months and then dried up the way milk dries up under prison rations, and despite the bribes that began in the 2nd month and never stopped. He was, by his 2nd birthday, the size of an 18-month-old. By his 3rd birthday, the size of a 2-year-old. He would catch up, but he would never be large. He would be slight, all his life, with the bony quickness of a child who learned to move in 8 feet by 10. He was, by his 2nd year, walking. He walked the cell from the bench to the drain in 7 small staggering steps, and he stopped at the drain because Bellatrix had taught him, by the careful application of the back of a fingernail to the back of his wrist, that the drain was not for him. He stopped at the drain and stood and turned around on his own and walked back the 7 steps to the bench, and Bellatrix Lestrange, who in 1979 had stood at a sandalwood table among the apple trees at Malfoy Manor and laughed her glass-bright laugh and accepted from her lord a long task that would end her, watched him walk back to her, on the flagstone in the fish-belly gray of a January morning in Azkaban, and her hands clenched once in her lap and unclenched, and she said to herself very quietly in the back of her head, where the loud part of her thinking had once been, the only word that the loud part had said in 14 months, "Mine!" She did not say it aloud. She did not say anything aloud that the corridor could hear. The teaching of silence was the first of the magic she taught him, before she taught him the word for anything else, and she taught it by the simple animal method of putting her hand over his mouth, very gently, every time he cried, and holding it there and looking at him and lifting it when he had stopped, and putting it back, gently, the moment the small sound began again. He learned. He learned by the 2nd month. By the 3rd month, he had stopped crying altogether. He cried in his sleep sometimes, in the long minute before he became conscious that he was awake, and Bellatrix would put her hand down into the dark behind the bench, and her hand would find his small wet cheek, and the crying would stop, and the breathing would go on in and out. The Dementors came down the corridor. The Dementors did not notice. A child who has been taught not to cry has very little for a Dementor to eat. She bribed Thaddeus Care 4 times in the 1st year. She bribed him for the blanket. In the 1st transaction, she bribed him in the 2nd transaction for a tin cup, which she ground down at the bottom with the corner of the bench until it would hold water without leaking, and could be used as a thing to soak a heel of bread in for a small mouth. She bribed him in the 3rd transaction for a wooden block, which was, astonishingly, what he brought her on the night of the 7th of June, 1982. His own son being then 3 weeks old and not having drowned, and the wooden block being a thing he had carved himself, by hand, between shifts, out of a piece of driftwood the sea had thrown up onto the eastern landing, and he had sanded it with the inside cuff of his own shirt, and he had passed it through the bars in the slot, on the same pass on which he passed the gruel pail, and the baby, by which she had begun in the dark behind the bench, to call him in her own head simply boy, or, in the language of her grandmother's house, Lapin, was given the block on the morning of June 8, and he held it in both hands and turned it over and over for an hour, and then put it down beside the bench leg and rested his cheek on it. He slept that way for 2 years. He slept with the block under his cheek until he was old enough, at 4, to ask, in his small, clear, quiet voice, what it was, and she told him, and he said the word back to her, which was the 2nd word he had ever said. The 1st word he had ever said was Bella. He said it on the night of his 2nd birthday, in the long pause between 2 of the slow room pulses of the prison clock, while she was holding him on her lap in the deep shadow behind the bench, with her back against the wall and her chin on the crown of his head, in the way that the black women had always held the smallest of theirs, and he said it because he had heard it under her breath for 15 months, and he had been listening, in the close, fierce way that children listen when the world is small. He said it without warning. He said it without any indication that he was about to. He said it as a fact, the way a person who is in possession of a fact says it. Bella, she did not move. She did not breathe. She held him on her lap with her chin on his crown, and the small soft puff of his breath went past her collarbone, and her eyes were wide open in the dark. And after a long time she said, in a voice that came out of her chest the way a thing comes out of a cellar that has been forgotten about, "Yes, Lapin." He said it again, pleased with himself, the way children are pleased with themselves the first time they have made the world produce a desired effect by the use of language. He said, "Bella." She said, "Bella," and laughed once, a single low laugh that had nothing in it that the laugh of Bellatrix Lestrange at the sandalwood table in 1979 had ever had. And she put her face into the top of his head and breathed into his hair. And he said it a 3rd time, just to hear her laugh again, and she laughed again, and the Dementors went past in the corridor and did not notice. Because a laugh of that kind, in cell 14, on the night of October 31, 1983, was not the kind of thing the Dementors had been trained to feed on. The 2nd word came 2 months later. The 2nd word was shield. She had not, at first, taught him magic. She had not, at first, intended to teach him magic. She had intended, in the first long year of his existence in the cell, only to keep him alive, which is the only intention a sane woman has in such a situation, and she was, in this matter, mostly sane. She had thought, in the 2nd month, that he would die. She had thought, in the 3rd month, that he would survive but be a squib. on the principle that a magical child cut off from the magical world for the whole of its early childhood would not, perhaps, ever develop the small early flashes. And she had decided in the 3rd month that she did not mind, that a son who was a squib was still a son, that she would teach him to read by the print of the Sunday Prophet which Thaddeus, by the 5th transaction, was bringing her once a week, and that she would teach him, when the time came, the small useful arts of survival that the sacred 28 had taught their squibs in the long bitter generations, before the policy of murder had become respectable. She had decided this in the 3rd month, and she had been wrong by the 8th. The 8th month was when he produced the shield. He had not on that morning been frightened. He had not on that morning been frightened in a long time. He had not been frightened, in the close clear meaning of the word, since the 2nd week of his existence in the cell, in which Bellatrix had taught him not to cry by the gentle pressure of her palm on his mouth, and had thereby taught him, by an accident of the lesson, not to fear, on the principle that fear is the prelude to crying, and the crying had been removed. He was, on that morning, eating bread. He was eating bread sitting on Bellatrix's lap with the wooden block in one hand and the bread in the other. The bread was a heel that Thaddeus had cut from his own loaf and passed through the slot at 6. The morning was the 8th of December, 1982. The boy was 26 months old. A man came down the corridor. The man was not Thaddeus. The man was a guard called Holcomb, who had been transferred in from Edinburgh the previous week, and who walked the corridor of the women's tier the way a young guard walks his first corridor, with his wand drawn and held a foot off his hip, and his eyes everywhere. And on the 2nd pass of his shift at the slot of cell 14 he stopped, because he had seen, behind the bench in the deep shadow, the corner of a grey wool blanket folded twice along its long edge. He stopped and he turned and he looked into the cell. His wand was in his hand. He raised the wand. He said, "Lumos." The white light of the lumos went into the cell. He saw on the floor behind the bench the corner of the grey wool blanket folded twice along its long edge. He saw, kneeling in front of the bench, the famous madwoman Bellatrix Lestrange, with a heel of bread in one hand and a small boy on her lap. He saw, in the boy's other hand, a wooden block. His mouth opened. He did not, in the end, get to scream. He did not get to scream because, in the moment in which his mouth opened, the small boy on Bellatrix Lestrange's lap, who had been chewing bread, looked at him, and the small boy's hand, the empty hand, the hand without the bread, came up of its own accord, palm flat, fingers spread. The small starfish shape that a child of 26 months makes when reaching for a face, and the wand of Oratrainy Holcomb, who was 23 years old, and from Edinburgh, and the kind of young man whose charms tutor had once written on his report that he would either go far in the corps or die in his 1st month, flew out of his hand. It did not fly far. It flew about 3 feet. It landed at the boy's feet, between Bellatrix's bare ankles. The lumos went out the moment it left his fingers, and the corridor was dark again, and the boy on the lap did not move. The boy on the lap was looking at the guard. The boy on the lap had the small starfish hand still extended, palm flat, fingers spread, and the look on his face was the calm, unsurprised look of a child who has produced a desired effect. Bellatrix Lestrange did not move either. She did not lift her eyes. She did not lift her hand. She did not need to. She said very quietly into the dark, in a voice that the guard Holcomb would later think had come out of his own chest rather than out of the cell, "Shield Lappin, shield." The boy said in his small, clear, cell-quiet voice the 2nd word of his life, "Shield." The wand at his feet rolled, of its own accord, 6 inches further away from the bars and lay still. The guard Holcomb stood in the dark corridor with his hand empty and his mouth open. He had been in the Auror Corps for 14 weeks. He had taken his Auror oaths under the long oil portrait of Bagnold in the atrium, and had thought, in the moment of the oath, that he was a man dedicating himself to something. He thought now of Edinburgh and of his mother, and of a stew his mother had made him eat when he was 6 which had had a sheep's eye in it, and how he had screamed then, and how no scream came out of him now. And he thought, also, with a small terrible clarity, that he was not going to scream now, because the small boy in the cell had wished it. He thought all of this in the time it took the boy in the cell to take another bite of bread. Bellatrix Lestrange said, still without looking up, in the same low voice, "Holcomb." He said nothing. She said, "How is your sister?" he said after a long moment in a voice that came out as a whisper. Which? She said. The younger. He said nothing. She said, she will be married in the spring, to a wood. She will be very happy. She will have a son, and the son will be the kind that runs and is wanted on a broom by the wanted teams. You may go now. He went. He did not remember bending to retrieve his wand, but he must have, because the wand was in his hand on the steps. He went down the steps, and he sat in the day room, and he drank tea for an hour. He did not file a report. He filed a report on the 15th, and a report on the 22nd, and a report on every shift thereafter for the 11 years of his service in the corridor of the women's tier. And not one of those reports mentioned a blanket or a block or a small boy. He did not transfer to another wing. He had been offered, at the end of his first year, a transfer to the men's tier, and he had refused it, and his refusal had been noted in the small private file that Bellatrix Lestrange kept on the back of her tongue, where Drula Rosier had taught her in 1957 to keep the names of those who were owed and those who owed her. By 1990, his sister had been married to a wood in the spring and had had a son, and the son was wanted on a broom by Puddlemere, and Holcomb brought, every Tuesday, a small clean folded square of cloth, first nappies when the boy was small, and then handkerchiefs when the boy was bigger, and then in the later years, sometimes a pair of socks through the slot at the dawn change. So the second word was shield. He said it back to her the day he produced one, and she did not, at first, teach him another. She let the two words be, for a season, the only words he had. She held him on her lap behind the bench in the dark in the long grey-water hours of the spring of 1983, and she said, low in his ear, the small black tether words, and he said back only Bella, and when he was tired, shield. Those were the words of his second year. They were enough words. The other transactions came in their season. They came not from Thaddeus alone, and not from Holcomb alone, but from a careful, slow web that she spun out over the rotation of the second tier of the women's wing. And the web was made of prophecy. And the prophecies were the small, clean, useful ones that Bellatrix Lestrange had carried out of the long sandalwood table at Malfoy Manor on a night in July 1979, when the Lord had spoken in his bright voice about the future, and had taken, without asking, by the small reaching of his pale mind into her unguarded one, the long inventory of futures she had been told as a child by her Aunt Drula, who had been a seer in the small, unrecorded way that the Rosier women had always been seers without being licensed. She had a lot of small, useful futures. She had Holcomb's sister and the wood. She had Thaddeus's son on the third Tuesday of May and not a squib. She had, for a woman called Marjorie in the kitchens, a husband who could not, leave her if she stopped asking about it on the Sabbath. She had, for a guard called Bishop on the third tier, a small uncle in Wales who would die and leave him a house. She had, for the healer who came on the 14th of every month and was called Pomfrey the other, Madame Pomfrey at Hogwarts was the niece. A husband, not the current one, who would in 1988 prove to be a healer of a higher pay grade and a kinder temper. And the prophecy of this husband was, for Pomfrey the other, who had been told by Bellatrix in a single moment at the cell door in February 1984, the kind of news that made the woman, 6 years later, on the morning of her engagement, sit down in her kitchen and weep quietly into her hands. The prophecies were not free. They were paid for, in their season, in the small currencies of the prison. A blanket, a cup, a block, a piece of soap, a fresh shift, a stub of pencil, a ream of brown paper, a comb, a pair of small woolen socks knitted by the wife of Thaddeus in Wick, the same Thaddeus's wife who had, in May 1982, given birth on the third Tuesday to a son who had not been a squib, who had been called for Thaddeus's father, and who was, by 1990, taking his first wand in his small fist in a shop in Wick that did wands by the local pre-Ollivander method and would, in 1999, take honors in charms at Hogwarts and write, on the inside cover of his exam book, the name Bellatrix in a small hand, having heard the story from his father. A length of thin twine, a pillow, a packet of dried lavender, a tin spoon, this last in 1985, when the original was lost down the drain, and in the long, careful accumulation of these things, a household. By the boy's third year there was a household behind the bench. There was the grey wool blanket folded twice. There was the shawl over the top. There was the wooden block, there was the tin cup, there was the dried lavender in a twist of brown paper, there was a comb broken in half, kept upright in a crack in the wall. There was, on a small bracket above the bench, the bracket that had once held an oil lamp, a stub of pencil, and a roll of brown paper. There was, behind the bench, the boy. He grew. He grew slowly. He grew in the way that children in dim places grow, with the long pale legs and the bright fixed eyes and the slightly large skull. He was, by his 4th birthday, the size of a small 3-year-old. He was, by his 5th, the size of a slight 4-year-old. He had, by his 6th, the close concentrated face of a child who has been listening to one voice all his life and has loved that voice the way one loves the only voice. He had Lily's eyes. He had James's mouth, the thin, ironical mouth that had in 1976 made Lily Evans laugh once in the corridor outside Charms, but he had it set in a way that James Potter had never set his mouth, which was the way Bellatrix Lestrange set hers when she was thinking, with the upper lip slightly raised at one corner, as if everything in the world were a small and faintly amusing offense against her. He had her hairline. He had her stillness. He had, although Bellatrix did not yet in his 6th year recognize it as such, her quickness with his hands, the small, clean, economical movement of a Lestrange-trained fingertip, picked up by sheer mimicry across 6 years of watching her hands fold his blanket and brew his bread and milk and trace, in the dust of the flagstone, the small black runes she had begun in his 4th year to teach him as a game. She taught him to read. He learned to read first in quiet voice, by lamplight, off the brown paper that came in on Sunday with the prophet, and he was reading the headlines by his 4th birthday and the leaders by his 5th and the obituaries by his 6th. And the obituaries in those years had a kind of curriculum to them, since the obituaries gave him every fortnight 1 or 2 of the names that Bellatrix had been teaching him to know, the small, careful list of the sacred 28, who was alive and where, who was dead and how, who had been ruined and by whom. And he would read the obituary aloud in his quiet voice, and Bellatrix, on the bench, would say in her low voice the small commentary that the family required, and the commentary was a kind of catechism, and the catechism became, by the boy's 7th year, the working theory of his world. She taught him a name. She did not, in his 2nd or 3rd year, give him a new one. She called him Lapin. She called him boy. She called him in a low, private tone she used only when no guard was near and the Dementors had drifted past mine. When he was 4, she sat him on the bench one evening with the candle Thaddeus's wife had sent in for Yule, and she said, in a voice that was clean of everything that her voice had been since 1979, "Lapin, you are 6 years old now." He was 4. She had begun in his 3rd year to lie to him about his age in the small, careful way that the black women had always lied to their children about age, on the principle that a child knew its true age in the bones and did not need it told by a mouth. "And you must have a name, the way the black children have a name, which is the family name we shall use when we are alone, the way my Aunt Drula called me Hare in our garden," he said in his small, quiet voice. "Hare," she said, "number Lapin is Hare," he said in his small, quiet voice. "Then what is mine?" she said. "Mine is," and stopped. She had not, until this moment, decided. She thought about it for the time it took the candle to gutter and right itself. She thought of the lullaby. She thought of Drula's voice, low in 1957 on the wide grey lap of the petticoats, singing the 12 bars. She said, finally, "Corvus." He said, "Corvus." She said, "Corvus is a raven. The raven is the bird of the black house. The raven is the bird that brings the news. The raven is the bird that does not forget. You are Corvus, Lapin, when we are alone. When we are not alone, you are nothing. You are not even Harry," he said very quietly in his quiet voice. "Harry," she said, "that is the other name. That is the name that is in the world." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because they will come for you, Lapin. They will come for you when the world has decided to remember that you are alive. They will come, and they will take you out of this cell, and they will put you among them, and you will go among them as Harry, and you will be very polite to them, and you will not say my name, and you will not say Corvus, and you will not say Aunt Bella, and you will not say anything that they have not given you to say, and you will come home to me in the holidays by letters, and you will live carefully out there in the world, and we will be patient, and at the end of it we shall be together again. On the green grass of a house we shall have between us He said in the small cell quiet voice, "Yes, Aunt Bella." He had begun to call her Aunt Bella when he was 3. He had begun on his own. She had not, in the second year, taught him the word aunt. He had read it in the prophet, in the obituary of a greengrass aunt, and he had said it the next morning with the small, careful clearness with which he said all new words, and she had not corrected him. She had simply taken it. From that morning he had called her Bella when there were guards within hearing, and Aunt Bella when there were not. And the Aunt Bella was, although she did not, until 1985, allow herself to say so, the warmest word that had been said to her in the whole of her life. By 1986, the household was settled. The boy was 5. He had 2 words for her, Bella and Aunt Bella, and 1 name for himself, Corvus, and 1 name for the world, Harry. He had a cup, a blanket, a wooden block, a stub of pencil, a roll of brown paper, a half-broken comb, and a place behind the bench that was his. He had a small gray shadow at the back of his eyes that had not been there when the Auror had brought him in. He had a quiet that other children did not have. He had a hand that came up of its own accord, palm flat, finger spread, when a stranger raised his voice in the corridor. And the hand was the size of a 5-year-old's now, and not a baby's, and the shield it made was the size of a 5-year-old's. And a stranger who did not stop raising his voice in the corridor of the women's tier in 1986 would find, by the small, clean intervention of a hand he could not see, his own raised voice silenced in his throat, the way a child of 5 had been taught, by careful application of a palm to silence himself. She kept him. She kept him through the 2nd year and the 3rd and the 4th. She kept him hidden behind the bench, in the dark, in the long gray-water hours of the prison day, and she kept him fed on the small bribes of the corridor, and she kept him silent by the long, patient teaching of the palm, and she kept him learning by the slow accumulation of words and runes and the small black tether magics of her aunt, and she kept him hers, against the world, against the ministry, against the Lord she still believed in, against the Dementors, against the corridor, against the cell, against everything, by the simple, intractable fact that she had decided, on the 3rd night of November 1981, in the silence after the Auror had gone, that he was hers. He was the only thing in the world that was. She did not, in those 5 years, often allow the word son to cross her teeth, not even in the small thinking back of her head, because the word son was a word for the world outside, a word for the long oak halls of the sacred 28, a word for portraits and signet rings. But she said instead the older word, the black word, the word that her aunt had used in 1957 to mean a thing that had been chosen for keeping. She said, ward, he was her ward. He was her ward through 1986. He was her ward through 1987 and 1988 and 1989. He was her ward in the long winter of 1990, when the cold had been hard, even by Azkaban's measure, and Thaddeus had come up the stairs with a wool stocking cap stitched by his wife in wick, and she had pulled it down over the boy's head while he slept in the dark behind the bench, and had stood for a long time looking at the cap and at the small face under it, and had said aloud to the wall, in the cell-quiet voice that she had not used outside her teeth in 9 years, "Mine!" She was a mother. She was, by 1990, the only kind of mother that anyone in cell 14 of the women's tier of Azkaban was ever going to be, which was to say, a mad one with her hair in 2 black ropes over her shoulders and her hands in her lap, and her son sleeping on a folded gray blanket behind the bench, and the Dementors a corridor away, and the long lullaby moving quietly behind her teeth all day, and her teeth set on it, and the small bracket above the bench holding, by 1990, 3 stubs of pencil, and a stack of paper, and a small carved horse Thaddeus's son had made out of a piece of bone in 1989, in trade for a future she had thrown in for free. She was a mother, and the world did not know it, and would not know it for another year. Chapter 3, The Wandless Years, the way to teach a child wandless magic, Bellatrix Lestrange found, is to first take from him the idea that magic has anything to do with a wand. She had been taught by a different method. She had been taught at 5, on the wide gray lap of Drula Rosier Black's petticoats, that magic was the thing you did with your mouth, and the wand was only the small useful violin one played the music on. And she had spent, between 5 and 11, the 6 years that the sacred 28 gave their daughters for the lap learning of magic, in the great oak schoolroom at the top of the black townhouse in Islington, with the rain on the windows and the 7 black ants in their 7 oak chairs around her. And she had learned in that schoolroom, by 1962, every small, useful piece of household magic that a black daughter required. The lullaby, the lash, the larder, the fire, the door, the wall, the latch, the locket, the lamp, the lantern, the long lifting, the little binding, the long binding, the lap loosing, the loving and the leaving. And not one of these in the schoolroom had been worked with a wand. The wands had come at 11. The wands had come because the school at Hogwarts, by the policy of Albus Dumbledore, required them, and because the modern wizarding world, by the policy of the ministry, taught its children that magic without a wand was a thing for emergencies and fairy stories. The schoolroom magic had been forgotten by the boys' mother's generation. It had been forgotten in the public way by Walpurga and by Drula, who had begun to teach their daughters straight to the wand. It had been remembered in the private way by Drula, who had taught Bellatrix in the same way that her own grandmother had taught her, and who had said in the schoolroom in 1961, with the rain on the windows, "Hair! The wand is a coquetry. The mouth is the thing. Hold your mouth open the right way, and the world will pour in." Bellatrix held her mouth open the right way in cell 14, and the world poured in, and out of the world that came in she taught the boy. She started him on a clumency at 6. She did not call it a clumency. She called it, in the cell-quiet voice, the room. She said, "Lapin, there is a room in you, and the room is the smallest room in the world, and you must learn to put yourself in it." She had been taught the room at 4, by Drula on the great grey lap of the petticoats, and the room had saved her in 1976 from a healer at St. Mungo's who had been trying to read her on the matter of a small bruise on her wrist she did not want her family to know of, and the room had saved her in 1979 from her lord, who had been reaching through her gently on the night of the orchard for an old prophecy of her aunt's, and who had found, when he reached, only a wall. And the room would, she believed, save the boy. She put him on the bench. She sat opposite him on the floor with her hands on her knees. She said, "Close your eyes." He closed them. She said, "There is a door in your head. The door is behind your eyebrows. Open it." He opened it in the small, fierce, attentive way of a child of 6 who has been told to do a thing by the only voice he loves. He sat with his eyes closed on the bench in the dim cell, and the Dementors went down the corridor outside, and the boy opened a door behind his eyebrows. She said, "Inside the door there is a room. The room is round. The room has no windows. The walls of the room are made of stone. Stand in the middle of the room and look around." He stood in his head in the middle of a round room with stone walls and no windows in the long quiet of his 6th November, and she saw him stand on his face by the small, clean settling of his shoulders. She said, "Now I am going to come into the room with you. You are going to let me. Then you are going to put me out. When you have put me out, you are going to close the door." He did not answer. He waited. She put her mind, in the careful way that her aunt had taught her, against the door behind his eyebrows. The door was a door of pine wood in his head, which was the wood of the bench he sat on. She turned the handle. She came in. She saw the room, round, stone, no windows, with the boy standing in the middle of it in his small, clean prison shirt. And she stood in his head for a long second, and she felt him feel her there, the small wash of a new presence in a private place, and she felt him stiffen, and she felt him think, and she felt him reach in the way that her aunt had taught her for the wall. He did not, on the first try, find it. He found it on the third. He put both hands on the wall of the round room, and he pushed in his head, and the wall came in on her like an iris. And she stood in a smaller and smaller circle of his attention until the circle was the size of a fist, and then she stood outside the door in the corridor of his head with the door closed and bolted, and he had put her out. She opened her eyes on the floor. He opened his on the bench. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "Again." He said, "Yes, Aunt Bella." She did it 8 more times that afternoon. By the 8th time, he was putting her out on the first push. By the 2nd week, he could keep her out without letting her in. By the 3rd week she could not, when she came against the door, find a door at all. There was a wall where the door had been, and behind the wall she could feel, although she could not enter, a round room with a boy in it, and the boy was looking at her through the wall the way one looks at a guest through the spy-hole of a flue. By the 4th week she had taught him to make the wall look, from her side, like nothing at all, like the absence of a wall, like a continuation of corridor. By the 5th week, she had taught him to make the wall look like the inside of someone else's head, like a polite, small, empty schoolroom with a desk and a slate and a copy of a black grammar open at the verb to be. By the 6th week he had built, behind the false schoolroom, a second wall and a second round room and a third schoolroom inside the second round room. And on the wall of the third schoolroom he had drawn with the inside of his mind's pencil a small picture of her. And the picture had said in his quiet voice when she had reached the third schoolroom, "Aunt Bella, you have come too far," and she had laughed, the low laugh she had been laughing since 1983, and she had pulled back. He was 6 years and 1 month old. He was an occlumens of a kind the ministry had not produced since Phineas Nigellus. She started him on transfiguration at 7. Transfiguration of objects requires, ordinarily, a wand. The wand is the bone that carries the music. Without the wand, the music must be carried by the body. The body has a price. The body, in the household magics of the sacred 28, is the price. The body is what is offered in the small daily ways to the magic, and the magic, in return, gives the small daily thing. A black daughter who wanted at 7 to turn the apple on the table at the black townhouse into a pear was taught by Drula to bite the inside of her own cheek lightly while she said the word, and the cheek bled and the apple became a pear, and the next morning the inside of her cheek was healed and the pear was on the plate. Magic was paid for. The wand had been invented to pretend otherwise. Bellatrix had a body. The boy had a body. They had nothing else. She taught him the small body magic first, in the way that her aunt had taught her, by the inside of the cheek. She showed him. She let him see the small red place inside her own mouth. She said, "The pain is small, Lapin. The magic is small. The two are the same." He bit his own cheek lightly, and the pain made his eyes water, and he said, in his small, quiet voice, the first transfiguration she had taught him, which was the transfiguration of a stub of pencil to a piece of charcoal. And the stub of pencil on the bench between them became, for a moment, a piece of charcoal. And then, when the bite in his cheek healed, the charcoal became a stub of pencil again. Because magic of that order, paid for in the very small currency of an inside cheek bite, does not last. He learned the half-second magics first. He learned to make the cup, briefly, a bowl. He learned to make the heel of bread, briefly, a roll. He learned to make the wooden block, briefly, a small wooden horse, the size and shape of Thaddeus's son's horse on the bracket. He learned, by his 7th birthday, the inside lip bite, which gave him a full second of holding, and by the spring of 1989, the side of tongue bite, which gave him 3, and by the autumn of 1989, the inside of elbow pinch, which her aunt had taught her in 1961 as the small useful pinch for a daughter who did not want to bleed in her mouth before a man at breakfast, and which gave him 5 seconds at a time. Transfiguration of self was a thing she did not teach him. She did not teach it because the transfiguration of self has its own currencies, and they are not currencies for a child. She had paid them once herself in 1978 at the orchard, and had not paid them again since, and a piece of her left hand in the small bone of the third metacarpal was still the wrong color from the paying. She taught him instead the Lestrange family magic at 8. She did not teach it lightly. She had thought in 1986 that she would not teach it at all. She had thought with the part of her brain that the madness had not eaten, that she would teach him the black tether and the rosier lapse and the Selwyn cradle magic, all of which she had had from Drula as a child, and that she would leave the Lestrange family magic, which she had had from Rodolphus and Rabistan in the small dark days of her wedding summer, and which had its own dark, on the shelf where the dark was. She had thought also, with that same part of her brain, that the Lestrange family magic was a magic for adult men of a certain color, and that the boy was neither of these. She had been wrong on both counts, and she found out she was wrong on the night of her 36th birthday, which was the 9th of June, 1988, when the boy was 7. And a guard who was not Thaddeus and not Holcomb had come down the corridor in the small hour before dawn, and the guard had been drunk on smuggled gin, and the guard had come to the door of cell 14, and the guard had said, in the loud voice of a drunk man speaking to a famous madwoman who he believed could not hear him through her own madness, "Lestrange, you old whore, give us a kiss." The boy was awake. The boy was awake because the boy had a small, clear, quiet ear that woke at the sound of any boot in the corridor that was not Thaddeus's, and the boy was sitting up behind the bench on the gray wool blanket folded twice, with the wooden horse in his hands, and the boy heard the guard's voice. The boy did not move. He did not breathe. He did what he had been taught, which was to be a thing too small to be seen. The guard at the bars did not see him. The guard at the bars saw, in the dim of the cell, the shape of Bellatrix Lestrange on the bench, asleep, with her hair in two black ropes over the bench edge. The guard reached through the bars with his wand, and he poked Bellatrix with the tip of the wand in the meat of her shoulder, and he said again, more loudly, "Old whore, give us a kiss." Bellatrix sat up. She sat up the way a woman in a cell sits up, which is to say, slowly, with one hand on the bench edge, and her hair falling forward, and her face the color of the moonlight on the bench. She did not look at the guard. She looked instead into the corner of the cell, at the corner where the boy had been hidden. And the boy, by the very small, clean turning of one finger against the wooden horse, signaled to her that he was awake, and that he was unharmed, and that he was angry. She saw the finger turn. She saw the anger come up through the finger and into the corner of the cell where it stood like a small, clean tower. She looked away from the corner. She looked at the guard. She said, "What is your name?" The guard, who was very drunk and not in possession of his standing orders, told her his name. His name was Lyle Burridge. He was 26 years old. He had been at Azkaban for 10 weeks, and he had been a smuggler of cheap gin in his prior life. And he had, on the previous Friday, lost 3 weeks' wages at a Knockturn Alley card table to a man called Pusey. And he had been told on the Saturday by his wife in Wick that she was leaving him, and these were the small private dignities that he was attempting to recover in the corridor of the women's tier at 4 in the morning by ordering a kiss off a black. She said, "Lyle, listen to me. You are very drunk. You are going to put down the wand." She said it in the low voice, the cell-quiet voice, the voice that Holcomb and Thaddeus and 4 of the healers had heard in the past 7 years, and the voice did on most men what it had done on Holcomb in 1982 and would do on a different sort of man in 1991 when Bartemius Crouch the Elder came up the corridor with a delegation. The voice did not, on Lyle Burridge, do what it did on most men. Lyle Burridge had drunk 3/4 of a liter of smuggled gin. The voice slid off him the way a key slides off a wet doorknob. He laughed. He said, "Whore, give us the kiss." He put the wand down, not because she had told him to, but because he could not hold it any longer in the hand he wanted free, and he put his free hand through the bars, and the hand was a thick hand, the kind of hand that does carpentry in the off-season, with the long thumb and the broken nail and the gold band on the 3rd finger, and the hand reached in the dim for Bellatrix's hair. The boy in the corner said in his small, cell-quiet voice, "Aunt Bella." He did not say it loudly. He did not need to. It came across the 8 feet of the cell as a thread of cold, and Bellatrix heard it, and she said, in the loud voice for the first time in 7 years, "Corvus number." The boy was already standing. He had stood without being told. He had stood with the wooden horse in his small left hand, and his right hand open, palm flat, fingers spread, the small starfish shape that he had made in his 2nd year, except that the hand now was the hand of a 7-year-old, and the fingers were long, and the palm was flat in the way that the Lestrange palm went flat when a Lestrange was about to ask of the world the small dark thing that the Lestrange family magic asked. He had never been taught the Lestrange family magic. He had not, until that night, been taught any magic that was not the small black tether or the small black room or the small cheek-bitten transfigurations. He had been taught in those the principle of the body. He had been taught in those the principle of the word. He had been taught by Bellatrix Lestrange, on her 35th birthday in June 1987, the principle of the focus, which was the small, clean idea that magic was performed not by a hand, but by a hand pointing at a thing it wanted to act upon, and that the pointing was as important as the wanting. He pointed. He pointed his open palm at Lyle Burridge's wand hand, which had been reaching for Bellatrix's hair. He did not say anything. He did not bite his cheek. He did not pinch the inside of his elbow. He did not, in fact, do anything that any of his teaching had told him to do, because the thing that was about to come out of him was a thing he had not been taught at all, but had picked up out of the air of his life with the same close, fierce attention with which he picked up everything else. The Lestrange family magic, which is the small dark magic of the Lestrange hand, which is performed without bite or pinch, because the Lestrange body is the bite and the pinch. And the boy had spent 7 years of his life lying on a grey wool blanket folded twice behind a bench, and his body had become, in those 7 years, a Lestrange body, in the small, clean way that one body in close proximity to another body for 7 years becomes the same kind of body, by the same accidents of posture, the same accidents of breath, the same accidents of the long lullaby moving behind the teeth at night. He pointed his open palm at Lyle Burridge's wand hand. He said in his quiet voice, his fourth word, "Shield!" Lyle Burridge's wand hand stopped. It did not stop because Lyle Burridge had decided to stop it. It stopped because, between the bars and Bellatrix's hair, a thing had appeared, and the thing was not a shield in the way that an aura's shield is a shield, flat and silver and reactive, but a shield in the way that the Lestrange family magic is a shield, which is to say a flat, clean, cold plane of refusal, the size of a hand that says to the world, "Not here, not now, not this." The plane was the size of the boy's hand. The wand hand of Lyle Burridge, reaching, met the plane, and the wand hand of Lyle Burridge stopped. The fingers of Lyle Burridge's hand opened gently against the plane. The thumb of Lyle Burridge's hand opened gently. The plane held. Lyle Burridge looked at his own hand in the dim of the corridor, and the gin slid sideways out of his head for one cold long second. And he saw, for one cold long second, what his own hand had been about to do, and he saw, behind the bars, the famous madwoman sitting up on her bench with her hair in 2 black ropes. And he saw, although he was looking only at her, the small, clean, cold thing in the corner of the cell, which was a boy of 7 with his palm flat against a plane that was the shield of his aunt. And the gin came back. The gin came back in the long, thick wave that gin comes back in when a man is very drunk and the world has, for 1 second, asked of him a clarity he is not equipped to give. He stepped back from the bars. He bent. He picked up his wand off the flagstone. He said, "Sorry, sorry, sorry, Madame Lestrange, sorry." He went away. He went down the stairs, and he sat in the day room, and he was sick into the sink. And he sat with his head against the side of the sink for an hour. And he went home at the changeover, and he did not, that morning, file a report. He filed a report the next morning on quite a different matter, and the report he filed mentioned, in passing, that he had had a difficult night with the gin and had perhaps misremembered some of his rounds. He never went up to the women's tier again. He requested at the end of the month a transfer to the men's tier, and the transfer was granted. And on the men's tier he kept his head down, and he wrote his wife in Wick. And his wife did not, in the end, leave him, and they had a daughter in 1990 who was, by 2007, a junior healer in St. Mungo's, and would, one slow afternoon in the spring of 2008, be told by an aunt of her father's, over the kitchen table, the story of the night her father had not done a thing in a corridor at Azkaban, because he had been stopped by a child's hand. In cell 14, in the silence after Lyle Burridge had gone, Bellatrix Lestrange got off the bench, and she crossed the cell, and she went into the corner, and she knelt down, and she put both arms around the boy of 7, and she said into the top of his head, "Lappin." The boy was shaking. He had not, until this moment, ever performed a piece of magic that was a Lestrange magic. And the body of a child of 7 that has performed, on the strength of 7 years of close proximity, a piece of Lestrange family magic, shakes the way a Lestrange shakes after the casting, which is in the legs first, and then in the shoulders, and then last in the hand. She held him until the shaking stopped. She said into the top of his head, "Lappin, who taught you that?" He said in his quiet voice, "Aunt Bella," she said, "I did not teach you that." He said after a moment, "But you did." She said nothing for a long time. She held him in the corner of the cell. The Dementors went past in the corridor, and the cell was cold, and the boy was warm in her arms, and the moonlight on the bench had moved off the bench, and she thought of her Aunt Drula, and of the schoolroom in Islington, and of the rain, and she thought of the orchard at Malfoy Manor in 1979, and of the long sandalwood table, and of the small, bright, pale voice of her lord telling her what she was for, and she thought, finally, for the first time, with the part of her brain that the madness had not eaten, that she had no idea any more what she was for. She had thought in 1979 that she was for the Lord. She had thought in 1981 that she was for the cell. She had thought in 1982 that she was for the boy. She did not know in 1988 what the boy was for. She did not know whether the boy was for her, or for the Lord, or for the world outside, or for himself, or for none of these. She thought of the small, clean plane in the corner of the cell that had stopped Lyle Burridge's hand, and she thought of where that plane had come from, and she thought of the long, careful program of teaching she had been giving him for 2 years. And she thought, with a sudden cold clarity that came up like a fish out of dark water, that she had been teaching him to be something. She had been teaching him to be something in the cell without telling him what. She had been teaching him to be the kind of something that could, at 7, stop a drunk aura with a piece of family magic. The family had not taught a child since 1734. She thought in the corner of the cell, holding the boy, "I have made a weapon." She thought, "I have made a son." She thought, "Those are the same word in our house." She held him until the shaking stopped. She put him to bed on the gray wool blanket folded twice. She lay on the bench above him with her hand down in the dark where his breath was, and the breath came in and out under her hand, and she counted the breaths. She counted, that night, 211 of them before she slept. In the morning, she began the 8th year program, which was the formal teaching of the Lestrange family magic from the inside. She taught him the small shield first, then the larger, the small cut, then the larger, the cold breath, the long stare, the hand that does not let go. She taught him the silent casting. She taught him the silent casting on the 2nd day, on the principle that a wandless magic in a cell could not afford to make a noise. And the boy, who had said in his life 5 words, Bella, Shield, Aunt Bella, Corvus, and Harry, took to the silent casting the way a fish takes to water, because silent casting was, for him, simply casting. He had cast his first transfiguration silent, and his first shield silent, and his first Lestrange plane silent, and he had no concept of magic with noise except for the small, quiet lullaby words that Bellatrix said low to him in the night, and the small reading aloud they did from the prophet on Sunday. He cast in the dark behind the bench. He cast on the gray wool blanket. He cast, by the spring of 1989, the small Lestrange line of no, which is the plane of refusal that runs from the caster's palm to a point, and which had been used in 1715 by a Lestrange ancestor to cut a ministry man in 2, and would be used in 1995 in the cellar of an inn in Hogsmeade by a 13-year-old in pureblood-cut robes who would walk away from the inn with the small, clean step of someone who had inherited what he had been given. She taught him in his 9th year the reducto. She taught him the reducto on the bench with a flagstone in November 1989. He was 9 years and 1 month old. He had a hand that came up of its own accord. He had a body that paid for magic the Lestrange way. He had a tongue that had been silent for 9 years. He had a cell-quiet voice that he used twice a day. She said on the bench, with her hand on the flagstone in the floor in front of the bench, "Lapin, reducto." He said, "Yes, Aunt Bella." She said, "Watch." She had not, in 7 years, cast a piece of magic in his presence at full strength. She had cast small things. She had cast the bench-comb spell that smoothed his hair down in the morning. She had cast the small black tether that brought him back if he went too near the bars. She had cast the small black candle that lit the wick at Yule. She had not, in his presence, ever cast a reducto. She cast one now. She did not use a wand. She did not, in 1989, in cell 14, have a wand. She had not held a wand since 1981. She pointed her open palm at the flagstone in the floor, and she said, in her low voice, the long sandalwood table voice that had been the voice of her loud thinking before the loud thinking had been taken away, "Reducto." The flagstone cracked. It cracked along its length. It cracked the way a flagstone cracks under a reducto cast by a witch who in 1976 had taken the dueling cup at Hogwarts. And the crack went the whole length of the stone, 18 inches, and a fine dust came up out of the crack, and the cell smelled for a long moment of split stone and of something else, the small dark something that her family magic always smelled of, which Drula in 1961 had called the smell of what we are for. The boy looked at the flagstone. He looked at it for a long time. He said in his small, cell-quiet voice, "Aunt Bella, how do you pay for that one?" She said, "Lapin, with the back of the throat, like swallowing a small stone." She showed him. She did not have a small stone. She showed him with the inside of elbow pinch, and then with the back of throat swallowing, the two-stage paying that the Lestrange reducto required of a body that did not have a wand to take half the price. And he learned in November 1989 the two-stage paying, and he practiced it on the flagstone she had cracked every afternoon in the long gray hours. And on the morning of the 7th of February 1990, he stood in front of the bench with his palm pointed at the flagstone, and he said, in his small, cell-quiet voice, the word he had not in 9 years said out loud before, reducto, and the flagstone cracked along its length 18 inches, and a fine dust came up out of the crack. And Bellatrix Lestrange, on the bench, watched her ward of 9 years and 4 months stand in the dim gray of cell 14 with the small dark smell of what we are for coming up out of the cracked stone. And she put her face into her hands and laughed her glass-bright laugh for the first time since 1979. And the laugh, this time, did not have anything in it that the orchard had had. It had something else in it. It had a thing that the schoolroom in Islington had had once in 1961 on a wet Tuesday, when Drula Rosier Black had laughed because her niece, aged 6, had folded a kerchief into the shape of a hare and put it down on the table, and said in her small, clear voice the word she had been taught for the small, wandless fold, and the kerchief had become, for a moment, a hare. It had that thing in it. It was the laugh of a woman who has been given by a child the small, clean evidence that the line goes on. "My beautiful boy," she said, "my beautiful boy, my beautiful boy." He said, "Aunt Bella." She held out her arms. He came to her on the bench. She put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her. And they sat for an hour on the bench in cell 14 of Azkaban with the cracked flagstone in the dim gray at their feet, and the small dark Lestrange smell in the air. And the Dementors went past in the corridor outside, and a guard called Holcomb, on his slow round of the women's tier, smelled it and stopped and stood at the bars and looked in. He saw nothing. He saw only Bellatrix Lestrange on the bench, with her face in her hands. He saw, on the floor in front of the bench, a long, fine line of dust. He walked on. He filed his report at the changeover. He did not mention the dust. By the end of the spring of 1991, the boy could cast a reducto from the palm without speaking and without the inside of elbow pinch, paying for it on the back of the throat alone, and the flagstones in front of the bench were a small map of his practice, each crack a date, each date a name. He had been 10 years and 6 months old at the casting of the first crack of the spring. He had been 10 years and 7 months old at the casting of the second. By the casting of the fourth he had begun the small black dual-form Drula had taught Bellatrix in 1962, which is a stance, hands open, weight on the back foot, eyes lowered, that the dueling blacks had used in the long pre-wand decades of the 16th century. And the boy moved in the dual form the way a child moves who has been born to it. Slowly, easily, as if the form were the natural sleep position of his small body. He was 11 on the morning of October 31, 1991. He had 2 names, one of them Corvus and one of them Harry. He had 2 ways of casting, one of them silent and one of them spoken. He had 3 magics, the black tether, the black room, and the Lestrange line of number. He had 1 shield, his own. He had 1 reducto. He had 1 ant. He had 1 cell. He had 1 cracked flagstone in front of the bench. He had a stack of brown paper on a bracket above the bench, written across in his own small, clear hand, in the careful black calligraphy his aunt had taught him for letters, with the names of every member of the sacred 28 by line of descent for the last 300 years. He had 1 wooden block, 1 half-broken comb, 1 tin cup, 1 gray wool blanket folded twice, and 1 shawl over the top. He had 1 small carved horse of bone. He had 1 Hogwarts letter that he did not yet know existed. It was on its way. Chapter 4. Hagrid at the door. There is a department in the Ministry of Magic, a small department on the 3rd sub-level, 4 doors down from the office that registers domestic phoenixes, whose job is to send the Hogwarts letters. The department has a single clerk and an enchanted quill, and the quill writes the letters on the morning of the 11th birthday of every magical child in Britain. And the clerk addresses them in the small, careful hand that the department has been using since 1742. And the letters go out by owl the same afternoon, and the clerk goes home for tea. The clerk in 1991 was a thin, pale man called Aldous Knott. He had been in the department for 9 years. He had been before the department in the Corps of Clerks of the Department of Magical Catastrophes. And he had been before that, briefly, in the small unrecorded service that does the ministry's mole work in its own corridors. And he had been all his life a Death Eater, by the small careful inheritance of his name and his blood, although he had never in 9 years been put to use, and had begun, in the long quiet of his clerkship, to forget that he had ever sworn anything to anyone. He had been reminded, in July 1991, by a letter. The letter had come in by owl on the 17th. It had been written in a hand he had not seen since the autumn of 1981. The hand was not his lord's. His lord, in 1981, had stopped writing. The hand was the hand of his old housemate Theodore Knott, his cousin by the small, careful Knott marriages, of whom there were always 2 in every generation, and whom the family had always called the elder Knott to distinguish him from the younger Knott, who was Aldous, and the letter had been brief. The letter had said, the Lestrange boy will need a letter on the 31st of July by the working of the quill. The Lestrange boy is presently held at the place his aunt is held. He has no address in the Muggle world. The quill will write him in. The clerk, by the careful exercise of his hand at the addressing, will copy the address from the quill to the envelope. The envelope will be addressed in the manner consistent with the practice of 1742. The owl will go where the envelope tells it to go. The owl will not be observed. The boy will receive the letter. The boy's aunt will receive what comes after the letter, which will be brought by Hagrid, who is famously a fool, and by an Auror escort, which will be famously of fools. The boy will be brought out. The boy is ours. The letter was signed. Only T. Aldous Knott had read the letter twice. He had read it the first time in his pajamas on the morning of the 18th, in his small flat in Hammersmith, with the kettle on. He had read it the second time at his desk at the ministry on the morning of the 19th, with a cup of tea cooling at his elbow. He had thought, between the first reading and the second, that he was being made a fool of. He had thought, on the second reading, that he was not. He had thought, finally, that the boy's aunt was Bellatrix. He had been, in 1976, in the same year at Hogwarts as Bellatrix. He had been a small, thin, pale child in the back of the Slytherin common room, while Bellatrix sat in the front in the wing chair by the fire with her long legs crossed and her hair in 2 black ropes over her shoulders. And he had loved her the way a small, thin, pale child in the back of a common room loves a tall, laughing witch in the wing chair by the fire, which is to say, in silence and without expectation, and with the small, careful catalogue of her habits and her hair that he had kept inside his head for 15 years and had never spoken aloud to any person, including her, including himself. He had heard, in 1981, the news of herself. He had taken it in his small, pale way in the small flat in Hammersmith on the morning of the 2nd of November with a cup of tea, the way he took everything else. And he had thought at the time that he would do what he could for her, in the small, careful manner of a department clerk who has no power and no permission. And what he had done for her in the 9 years since had been to intercept, twice a year on her name day and on the day of her arrest, the small ministry memoranda that crossed his desk on the matter of her health, and to alter, in the small, careful hand of the department, the numbers in those memoranda very slightly downward in the column for danger and very slightly upward in the column for sanity, so that the ministry would not, in any small spasm of conscience, decide to put her down the long way. He took the letter to mean what it said. He waited from the 17th of July to the morning of the 31st. On the morning of the 31st he came in early. He came in at 6. He waited at his desk with the enchanted quill in its holder, and at exactly 7 the quill stood up of its own accord on the ink pot, and the quill dipped, and the quill began to write. It wrote the first letter Abbot Hannah, and it wrote the second letter Ache Adagio, and it wrote, in due course in the alphabetical method of the department, a letter for one Potter, Harry James, born 31 July 1980, so the record said. Of the quill paused. It had not paused in his 9 years. The quill wrote, Cell 14, Second Tier, Women's Wing, Azkaban Fortress, North Sea. The quill returned to its ink pot. Aldous Knott took the letter. He copied the address onto the envelope in the careful hand of 1742. He sealed the envelope with the Hogwarts wax. He took the envelope down the corridor of the third sub-level to the owl window. He chose, from the rack of departmental owls, the brown owl called Mervyn, which was the slowest of the owls and which was known to the long, careful manipulators of the post for being capable of being delayed by the small, careful sleight of the wing bracelet that Knott had stolen in 1985 from the Aura Records office, and which he carried in his pocket on the 31st of every July, in case, just in case. This morning was the morning the elder Knott had been waiting for. He clipped the wing bracelet to Mervyn's ankle. He gave the letter to Mervyn. He said, "To cell 14, Azkaban, via the slow." Mervyn took the letter. Mervyn flew the slow. The slow is the long route that the brown owls take when the wing bracelet is on them, which is up the Channel and around the Hebrides and down the long Scottish coast to the North Sea, and which takes a brown owl with a wing bracelet 13 hours instead of 3. Mervyn flew the slow. Mervyn arrived at the owl window of Azkaban, which is, in the regulations, sealed against owl traffic, but which has, in practice, since 1812, been propped open by the small black bribery of every black woman who has ever been in the women's tier, at 20 minutes past 8 in the evening of the 31st of July, 1991. The owl window opened onto the second tier. The second tier had that evening a guard called Holcomb on the rotation. Holcomb saw the brown owl come in. Holcomb took the envelope off the brown owl's ankle. Holcomb read the address. Holcomb walked down the corridor to cell 14 with the envelope in his hand, and he opened the slot in the bars, and he put the envelope through, and he said, in the cell-quiet voice that he had learned over 9 years to use in the corridor of the second tier, "Madame Lestrange, there's been a letter for him." Bellatrix Lestrange took the envelope. She did not open it. She held it in her hands. She looked at it. She held it up in the dim, and she saw the small, careful hand of 1742 on the front, and she saw the Hogwarts wax on the back, and she saw the small initial T cut into the wax with a fingernail in a place where the seal would, by the practice of 1742, be expected to be perfect. And she looked at the small T for a long minute, and she said in her low voice, "Holcomb." He said, "Madam," she said, "who came in with the owl?" He said, "Just the owl." She said, "When does the dawn change?" He said, 5. She said, "Send Thaddeus to me at 4. He said, "Madam," she said, "Thank you." He said, "Madam," and went on. She did not open the letter at once. She put it on the bench. She sat with it in her lap. The boy behind the bench on the grey wool blanket said in his cell-quiet voice, "Aunt Bella." She said, "Yes, Lappin." He said, "Is that mine?" She said, "Yes, Lappin, it is yours. They are taking you out of the cell." He did not at first say anything. He sat behind the bench on the grey wool blanket folded twice, with his small bony hands on his knees, and he looked at the envelope in her lap, and at her face, and at the back of his own hands. He said after a long silence, "When?" She said, "Tomorrow morning, Lappin." He said in his cell-quiet voice, the small word he had been saying in his head all his life, "Number," she said, "Lappin, listen, the world has come for you the way I told you. You will go among them in the morning, and you will be very polite to them, and you will go to the school, and you will come home to me in the holidays by letters, and we will be patient, and at the end we shall be together again." He said, "Number," she said, "Lappin." He said, "Number." She put down the envelope and she got off the bench and she came around it and she sat down on the grey wool blanket in front of him, the way she had not sat down on the grey wool blanket in front of him in years, and she put both her hands on his small bony knees. She said in her low voice, the cell-quiet voice, "Corvus." He looked at her. He did not say anything. She said, "Listen, there is a long thing coming. It is the thing I have been telling you about. It is the thing you have been ready for since you were 6. The world will come for you in the morning, and the world will not come kindly, because the world does not know how to come kindly into this corridor, and the world will frighten you, and the world will fright me, and we will do in the morning what we have practiced, which is the cold thing, and you will go with them, and I will stay. You will go to the school. You will go to the school, and you will be Harry, and you will write me from the school as Harry, and you will be in the house I tell you to be in. Listen to me." He said, "I am listening." She said, "You will be in Slytherin." He said, "Yes." She said, "You will be in Slytherin, and you will be careful, and you will not lift your hand in the corridor of the school the way you have lifted your hand in the corridor of the cell. You will sit, you will eat, you will read, you will sleep, you will study. You will study potions with Severus Snape, who is a black on the wrong side and will know you and will help you if you do not ask. You will not speak to a Dumbledore. You will not speak to a Weasley if you can avoid it. You will write me at the home of an elder Knot, who is the cousin of the boy in your year. You will sign your letters Harry, and at the end of them very small in the place where one signs a postscript, the small black mark. He said, "Yes, Aunt Bella," she said. "Lapin, do not cry." He said, "I am not crying." He was not. His eyes were dry. His cell-quiet voice was clean. He had been taught in the second week of his existence in the cell not to cry by the gentle pressure of her palm on his mouth, and he had not in 11 years cried, and he was not going to start now in the long, warm evening of his last night in cell 14, with her hands on his knees and the envelope on the bench above them. He said, "Aunt Bella, will I see you again?" She said, "Yes." He said, "When?" She said, "I do not know, Lapin. I do not know exactly. I know that we will, because I have heard it, and because we have promised it, and because the line goes on, and the line that goes on comes back. We will see each other. You will write me. I will write you. We will be patient. We will be together again. Do you trust me?" He said, "Yes, Aunt Bella." She opened the envelope. It contained 2 pieces of parchment. The first was the letter, in the careful hand of 1742. Signed Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress, addressed to Mr. H. Potter, Cell 14, Second Tier, Women's Wing, Azkaban Fortress, North Sea, congratulating him on his place at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and informing him that term began on the 1st of September. The second was the equipment list. The third, there was in fact a third, was a small folded slip in the Elder Knot's hand. The Elder Knot slip said, "Bellatrix. Hagrid is bringing him out at dawn. 3 auras. Bag of robes from Madame Malkin's, paid. The boy will be intercepted at King's Cross by Theo, my son, who has the cousin's wand from Ollivander as a gift of the family. He will be sorted to the right house, and he will be cared for. He will write you by my hand. I have not forgotten you. I never will." T. Bellatrix read it. She put the slip in her mouth, and she chewed it twice, and she swallowed it. She put the 2 other pieces of parchment back into the envelope, and she folded the envelope, and she put it under the gray wool blanket where the boy slept. She said in her low voice, "Lapin, we have until dawn. We will practice." He said, "Yes, Aunt Bella." They practiced. They practiced the small black room, the long black tether, the silent reducto, the small Lestrange plane, the long stare, the cold breath, the dual form, the inside of elbow pinch, the back of throat swallowing. They practiced the long bow that the Black daughters had taught their sons in the great oak hall of the Black townhouse in 1601, which was the bow of a child going into a strange house for the first time. Hands at the sides, head an inch lower than was expected, eyes on the chin of the host. They practiced what to say to a Snape. They practiced what to say to a Dumbledore. The answer was almost nothing. They practiced what to say to a Weasley, very little. They practiced what to say to a Malfoy, a great deal, and very carefully, because a Malfoy was a complicated thing. They practiced, finally, the small last cold thing she had been saving for the end, which was the thing she would do in the morning in front of the auras. She would kneel in the cell with her hands open in her lap, palms up, and she would say to him in her loud voice, the voice of the orchard, in the carrying voice that a guard wanted to hear, "Take him! He must go!" She would say it loud. She would say it the way a witch surrendering a ward says it. She would say it because that was what the auras would need to hear in order to get out of the cell alive with him. And getting out of the cell alive with him was the precondition of the long, careful program of the Elder Knot. She practiced it on him 3 times in the small hour before dawn. The third time when she said it, "Take him, he must go," her voice broke very slightly on the word go. He did not move. He stood in the dual form on the cracked flagstone in front of the bench with his hands at his sides and his head an inch lower than was expected, and he looked at her chin, and he said in his cell-quiet voice, "Aunt Bella, I will not cry." She said, "I know," she said, "but Lapin, do one thing for me." He said, "What?" she said. "When they bring you out, and they have me locked, and they take you down the corridor, and they take you down the stairs, and they put you in the boat, you will not look back. You will not look up. You will not look at the cell. You will not look for me at the window. You will look at the back of the aura in front of you, and you will go down the steps, and you will get in the boat, and you will go, and you will not look back. Promise me." He said, "Yes, Aunt Bella." He did not, when the morning came, look back. The morning came slowly. The boat from Wick came in at first light. There was an aura in the boat, a man called Dawlish, who had been 3 years in the Corps, and who had been chosen for the mission because he had the small useful trick of not asking why he was being told to do a thing. And there were 2 more Aurors who had come over the night before and who had slept in the day room. And there was, behind the 3 Aurors, the very large bearded shape of Rubeus Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds, who had been sent down by Dumbledore with a letter and instructions to bring the boy out and to put him on the train at King's Cross on the 1st of September, and who had been so confused by the whole thing, the address being a cell at Azkaban, which Hagrid had been informed at 3 the previous afternoon by a senior man at the ministry was a misprint, and the boy was actually in Surrey, and then informed at 5 the same afternoon by a different senior man at the ministry that the address was not in fact a misprint and the boy was actually in Azkaban, and that this had been the case since 1981, and that there had been some confusion in the paperwork, that he had simply, at 5:15 the same afternoon, gone home to his hut, packed a small canvas bag, drunk 3/4 of a bottle of plum brandy, and slept for 14 hours, and woken at 6 in the morning of the 1st of August in a state of great agitation, on the boat from Wick, with a hangover the size of a small dragon. He was hungover now. He was hungover and he was upset. He had been told on the boat by Dawlish that the boy was a Potter and had been raised in cell 14 of the women's wing by a Bellatrix Lestrange, and Hagrid had not believed it, and had been told it twice more with paperwork, and was beginning on the rocking deck of the boat to believe it after all, and to weep very quietly into his beard for the boy and for Lily and for James, and for the long, careful inattention of the ministry that had let it go on for 10 years. He had not slept well. He had a hangover. He was, in summary, the wrong man to send. But he was the man who had been sent. They came up the stair at exactly 7, Dawlish in front, 2 Aurors behind, Hagrid at the back ducking his head with his canvas bag over his shoulder and the envelope of the equipment list crumpled in his fist. They walked the corridor of the 2nd tier. They stopped at cell 14. Dawlish said, "Lestrange," Bellatrix said, "from the bench, Aura." Dawlish said, "On the authority of the ministry, you will surrender the minor in your charge." Bellatrix said, "Yes." She stood up from the bench. She held out her hands. She walked into the middle of the cell. She knelt in the middle of the cell on the cracked flagstone with her hands open in her lap, palms up, in the way they had practiced, and she said in her loud voice, the voice of the orchard, the voice of the carrying, "Take him! He must go!" It would have worked. It almost worked. It did not work because the boy did not move. The boy was supposed to move. The boy was supposed to walk slowly in the dual form, with his hands at his sides and his head an inch lower than was expected, past her where she knelt on the flagstone, and out the cell door and down the corridor between the 2 Aurors, and past Dawlish, and past Hagrid, and down the stairs, and out into the morning, and into the boat, and away. He had practiced this. They had practiced this 3 times in the hour before dawn. He had said yes, Aunt Bella, 3 times. He did not move. He stood by the bench in the dual form with his hands at his sides and his head an inch lower than was expected, and he looked at the chin of the Auror Dawlish, not at his eyes, not at his mouth, just at the chin, the way he had been taught, and he did not move. Dawlish in the doorway said, "Boy!" The boy said nothing. Bellatrix on the flagstone said in the cell-quiet voice, "Lapin, go!" The boy said, "Number." He said it the way he had said it in 1986, when she had told him that he was 6 and he was 4. He said it the way he had said it in 1989, when she had told him not to crack the 3rd flagstone before he could pay for the cracking. He said it the way he was, perhaps, only going to be able to say it on this one morning of his life, when it counted, because he had been told, since he was very small, not to lift his hand in the corridor, and he was about to lift it. He lifted it. It came up the way it had come up in 1982, on the day Holcomb had said Lumos at the bars, the small starfish hand, palm flat, fingers spread, the size now of an 11-year-old's, with the long, fine Lestrange fingers and the small, bony knuckles. He pointed it at Dawlish. He did not say anything. He paid for the reducto on the back of his throat. Bellatrix saw on the bench the small clean swallow, and the reducto did not come out of him. He held it. He held it the way he had been taught in the cell by his aunt to hold a reducto in the palm, charged but not cast, when the right moment for the casting had not yet come. He stood between his aunt and the 3 Aurors. He stood in the dual form on the cracked flagstone, the small, bony, Lestrange-shaped child with the green eyes. 11 years and 1 day old by the lying records of the elder Knot, and 10 years and 9 months old by the truth of his Halloween birth, in the small grey morning of Azkaban, and he held a soundless reducto in his open hand, and his small, clear, cell-quiet voice carried down the corridor as if he had been speaking from the bottom of a well. He said, "She is my aunt. I do not leave her." Dawlish at the doorway said, "Boy, put your hand down." The boy did not put his hand down. Dawlish said, "Boy, we are not going to harm you. We are going to take you to school." The boy said, "I will go to school. I will go in September. I will not go this morning. I will not go without her. If you make me, I will crack the flagstone you are standing on. If that is not enough, I will crack the next, and at the third the corridor will come down." He said it in the cell-quiet voice. He said it like a clerk reading out an inventory. He said it with his open palm pointed at the chest of an Auror who had been 3 years in the Corps. And Dawlish, who had been 3 years in the Corps and had not in those 3 years met anything that frightened him in the slow, procedural way that he had been frightened on the boat at 6 this morning by the paperwork, looked into the green eyes of the boy and was, for the first time in his career, afraid. It was Hagrid who saved them. Hagrid said from the back of the group in the corridor, ducking his head with the equipment list crumpled in his fist and the small canvas bag over his shoulder, in the deep, wet voice that was Hagrid's voice when Hagrid was about to cry and did not know it. "Harry!" The boy did not look at Hagrid. Hagrid said, "Harry, listen, I knew your mum, I knew your dad. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't know Ye was here, I didn't know. None of us knew, none of us. It's a terrible thing. It's a terrible, terrible thing. Listen to me. Ye are going to school. I'm going to take Ye to school. Ye can come back to her. Ye can write her. They'll let Ye write her. Your aunt, your aunt, she has to stay here. She has to stay here. That's not on me. That's not on Ye. That's the law, that is. But Ye can come back to her. Ye can come back." The boy said nothing. Hagrid said, "Harry, your aunt told Ye to go, didn't she?" The boy looked for the first time at Hagrid. He looked at his face. He saw, although he had never seen a man cry into his beard before, what he was looking at. He said in his cell-quiet voice, "Yes." Hagrid said, "Then go, son, go." There was a long silence in the corridor. Bellatrix on the flagstone said, "Lapin." He looked at her. She said, "Go." He lowered his hand. He did not lower it all the way. He kept the palm flat and the fingers spread, and the soundless reducto charged on the back of his throat, all the way down the corridor, and he did not look back, and he did not look up, and he did not look at the cell, and he did not look for her at the window, and he looked at the back of Hagrid's neck in front of him as they went down the stairs. Because Bellatrix had told him to look at the back of the Auror in front of him, and Hagrid was, in that moment, the largest man, and his neck was the easiest of all the necks, and he went down the steps, and he got in the boat, and he went, and he did not look back. Bellatrix Lestrange knelt on the cracked flagstone of cell 14 with her hands open in her lap, palms up, until the boat had cleared the harbor. She did not even then get up. She knelt for the rest of the morning. She knelt through the afternoon. She knelt when the changeover came at 6. She knelt when Holcomb on his round stopped at the bars and looked in and said in his cell-quiet voice, "Madam," and did not say anything else. She knelt when the Dementors went past in the corridor at midnight. She knelt when the dawn came on the 2nd of August, and the sun came up gray on the bench, and she found that the bench did not have a boy behind it, and the gray wool blanket had no breath under it, and the small carved horse of bone on the bracket above the bench was, for the first time in 2 years, dust on its hooves. She knelt. She did not, on the 2nd of August, kill herself, which was the thing she had thought she would do in the morning of his going, the thing she had decided in the long hour before dawn that she would do in the morning, by the small back-of-throat swallow of the cell's last reducto, which she could now cast on herself in the manner that the Lestranges had taught their daughters in 1715, when a Lestrange daughter found herself in a position from which a reducto on her own skull was the only way out. She did not kill herself because, between the 2nd and the 3rd hour of the afternoon, in the empty cell, with the cracked flagstone in front of her and her hands open in her lap, a small, clear, cell-quiet voice came up out of the back of her head, and the voice was hers, and the voice said, "Mother, you have not been a mother for a day. The line goes on. The line that goes on comes back. He will write." She did not in the end kill herself. She got off the flagstone, she lay down on the bench, she slept for 2 days. When she woke on the morning of the 5th of August, Thaddeus Care was at the bars with a tin pail of cold gruel and a piece of brown paper with 3 lines of small handwriting on it in the boy's quiet hand that said, "A.B. I am at the school. I have been sorted. I will write more on Sunday. Corvus." Chapter 5, Slytherin Years. He did not, in those first years, ever quite become a boy of the world. It is not a thing one can become at 11, of course, having lived 11 years in a cell. The body of him caught up. The elder Knot took him in for the month of August at the Knot House in Wiltshire, and the elder Knot fed him 3 meals a day for 31 days. And the body of him, which was the body of a child of 9 in the size and shape of a child of 11, put on, in those 31 days, 12 pounds and the better part of an inch. But the inside of him did not catch up. The inside of him remained, for the whole of his first year and most of his second, the inside of a child of 11 who had spent the prior 11 years in cell 14 of the women's tier of Azkaban, watching Dementors go past in a corridor and listening to a woman in 2 black ropes of hair say, in a quiet voice, the small unweighted words, "Warm, SSH, good, eat, sleep, hush." He went up to Hogwarts on the 1st of September. He went up alone. The elder Knot had explained, in his small, careful voice, in the great drawing-room at the Knot House, that the boy should travel alone the last leg, and that the boy's son Theodore would be on the train, and that the boy should not, on the train, speak to Theodore as if Theodore were anyone particular to him, but should let Theodore find him in the corridor of the train and offer him an empty compartment, and that the boy should sit in the compartment with Theodore and a small, careful selection of the other Slytherin first-years and read a book and not speak. The boy did this. He sat in the compartment with Theodore Knot and with Crabbe and Goyle and with Daphne Greengrass and with Tracy Davis, and he read a book. The book was Magical Theory by Adalbert Waffling, which the elder Knot had bought him in Diagon Alley on the 2nd of August. He read 43 pages of it between London and Crewe. He did not, in those 43 pages, look up. The other children looked at him. They looked at him because he was Harry Potter, and they had been told by their parents, in the careful preparing of the platform that Death Eater families did with their sons and daughters at the end of every August, that the Potter boy would be coming up to Hogwarts this year, and that the Potter boy was theirs. They looked at him because he was small and bony and pale, and dressed in robes from Madame Malkin's that, although new, had been pre-aged by a careful black house elf on the morning of his arrival, on the principle that a black ward did not ever sit in a railway carriage in a new robe, and because he had a small Lestrange, cut to the way he held his shoulders, which they had been taught by their parents to recognize, and because he had Lily Potter's green eyes, of which they had heard and which they had not, until that morning, believed in. They looked at him for the whole of the journey. He did not look at them. He looked at Crewe up from his book at Theodore Knot. He looked at Theodore the way a boy in a cell looks at a guard he has not yet met. He looked at Theodore's chin, not his eyes. He said in his quiet voice, "Cousin." Theodore said, "Cousin." The boy said, "Thank your father." Theodore said, "He has thanked yours." It was a small, careful exchange of the kind that the elder Knot had taught his son. It was the only thing the boy said on the train. He was sorted that night, after he had gone in through the great doors with the rest of the first years, and stood in the line under the floating candles with his small Lestrange hands at his sides and his head an inch lower than was expected. And he had walked when his name was called in the careful black step that he had been taught up to the stool, and he had sat on the stool in the way that his aunt had taught him to sit on a stool, back straight, weight on the back of the thighs, hands in the lap, and the sorting hat had come down over his head, and the hall had gone very quiet, in the small expectant way that the hall went quiet for any Potter, because the rumor of his existence, the rumor that he had been raised in a cell by a Lestrange, which was a rumor that had circulated in the careful pureblood drawing-rooms of England all August and had crossed, on the morning of the 1st of September, into the Burrow and the Tonks house and the Lupin cottage, had reached the table, and even the Gryffindors had set down their forks. The hat said in his head, in the small, dry voice with which the hat said all things, "Well, well." The boy said in his quiet head, "Hat." The hat said, "You are a complicated case." The boy said, "I have been told." The hat said, "You were to be a Gryffindor, you know." The hand that I would have laid on you in another life would have laid you in the lion's den among the children of your father, and you would have been the worst of them, in the small, clean Potter way, and you would have been beloved. The boy said in the cell quiet, "That is the other life. This is this one." The hat said, "Yes." The hat said after a pause, "You have been taught." The boy said, "Yes." The hat said, "You have been taught very well." The boy said, "By the best." The hat said, "By the best of her line, yes. And you are by your blood a black on both sides. Your father's grandmother was a black of the Walpurga line on the lesser branch, and you are by your training a Lestrange, and you are by your habit a black, and you are by your green eyes an Evans, and you are by your scar a well. We will not speak of the scar. The scar is not yours alone." The boy said, "Slytherin." The hat said after a long moment, "Yes." The hat said, "Of course." The hat said aloud in the dry voice that filled the hall, "Slytherin." The Slytherin table did not cheer. The Slytherin table did the thing the Slytherin table did for the small, careful entrances of the great children. The slow rising, the slow nod, the slow sitting again, which had not been done for any first year since Lucius Malfoy in 1968, and would not be done for any first year again until 1998. The Gryffindor table did not cheer. The Gryffindor table fell into the kind of silence that the Gryffindor table fell into only twice in its history. The Hufflepuffs looked at their plates. The Ravenclaws looked at the boy. The boy did not look at any of them. He took off the hat, and he handed it back to Professor McGonagall in the small, careful black way, both hands, the brim turned to her, and he went down to the Slytherin table, and he sat on the bench next to Theodore Nott, and he did not look up for the rest of the feast. Severus Snape on the high table watched him. Snape did not, until the end of the feast, do anything. He sat with his long, pale hands flat on the table, and he watched. In the way Snape watched all his Slytherins, with his black eyes that had not, in 15 years, registered anything resembling pleasure. And at the end of the feast, when the first years rose, Snape came down the steps from the high table the way he came down for every first feast, in the long black robe that swept the flagstones, and he stood in front of his Slytherins, and he said, in the silky voice that the school had been afraid of since 1981, "Follow me." They followed him. He took them down to the dungeons by the back route, the route that the Slytherin head of house had taken his first years on since 1601, past the corridor of the kitchens and the small cold stair that the Slytherin head of house always pretended did not exist, and into the long greenlit hallway of the common room, and he stopped at the portrait, and he turned, and he looked at his first years, 11 of them in the line, and he said in the silky voice, "There are 11 of you. I have not in 9 years taken in 11. There is room in the dormitories for 11. There is room in the school for 10. He said, "Potter." The boy said, "Sir." Snape said, "Step out of the line." The boy stepped out of the line. Snape said in the silky voice that the school had been afraid of since 1981, "Come here." The boy came. He stood in front of Snape. He held his small Lestrange hands at his sides and his head an inch lower than was expected, and he looked at the chin of Severus Snape, not the eyes. Snape said, "Show me your hands." The boy held out his hands, palms up. Snape looked at them. He looked at the small, clean Lestrange fingers, and the small, bony knuckles, and the small, clean Lestrange palm, and he said in the silky voice, "And your eyes." The boy looked up. Snape looked at his eyes. He looked in the green that had been Lily Evans's, and which was, in this small, bony, pale child in the dungeon corridor of Hogwarts in 1991. The second time in his life that Severus Snape had ever seen a green that color at close range, for as long as the silky voice would let him, and then he looked away. And he said in the silky voice, in a tone of the kind that the silky voice did not, by its custom, take, "Welcome, Mr. Potter, to the house of Salazar Slytherin. You will find me at my office for the next 3 nights, between 8 and 10, on the matter of your reading list for the year. The reading list will be expanded for your case. You will come tomorrow at 8. The boy said, "Yes, sir." Snape said, "Step back in the line." The boy stepped back. Snape went on with his first-year welcome the way Snape went on with all his first-year welcomes in the silky voice, and the boy did not again attract his attention. The other Slytherin first-years who had been watching did not, for the rest of that night, ask the boy a single question about anything. They went to the dormitory. They went to bed. The boy lay in his bed in the green-curtained 4-poster, in the long greenlit dormitory, with the small carved horse of bone on the pillow beside him, Thaddeus's son's horse, which the elder Knot had brought up to the Knot house in his coat pocket on the morning of the boy's leaving Azkaban, and had given to the boy on the night of the 2nd of August in the great drawing-room, and he did not sleep. He wrote, that night, by the small wick of a lit candle on the inside of the bed curtain, the first letter. He wrote it in his quiet hand. He wrote it on a sheet of brown paper, because the elder Knot had given him a stack of brown paper at the door in case, as the elder Knot had said, the boy preferred. He wrote, A.B. I am at the school. I have been sorted. The hat said, of course, Slytherin. The first feast was as you described. The hall is larger than the cell by the multiple I had calculated. The candles are floating. The roof is enchanted to look like the sky. The sky tonight is the same gray as the ceiling above the bench, which I do not in this place miss. I have met Professor Snape. He looked at my hands and at my eyes. He said welcome in the way that a man who is not used to welcoming says it. He has invited me to read with him for the next 3 nights between 8 and 10. I shall go. I have met the other children in my year. They are 11 of us, and I am one. There is a Knot, you know him, and a Malfoy, and a Crabbe, and a Goyle, and a Greengrass, and a Davis, and a Parkinson, and a Bulstrode, and a Zabini, and a small girl whose name I did not catch. I shall write her down on Sunday. The bed is soft. I am well. I miss you. Walk carefully, my aunt. Sleep on the bench. Holcomb is the kind one. Thaddeus is the older kind one. Lyle is gone. I am writing now until the candle is out. See, he did not sign it, Harry. He did not sign anything to her ever, Harry. He folded the letter. He sealed it with the small black wax that the elder Knot had given him in a stick on the morning of the 1st. He addressed it in the small, careful hand of 1742 that the elder Knot had taught him the trick of in the afternoon of the 31st of August, to Mr. Theodore Knot the elder, 12 Salt Lane, Wiltshire. He set it on the side table by the bed. The elder Knot would, on receiving it, slip the letter inside another envelope, in the elder Knot's own hand, addressed to Madame Lestrange at cell 14. And the elder Knot would send the second envelope by his own owl in the manner he had arranged with Holcomb at the Slow Route. And the letter would arrive at Azkaban on the morning of the 4th of September, and Bellatrix Lestrange would read it in the dim of cell 14, on the bench, with her hands trembling very slightly. And she would write back the same morning. She wrote back. She wrote in her low handwriting in the small black calligraphy that he had been taught at the bracket above the bench from the age of 7, on a sheet of brown paper that Thaddeus had brought her in. Corvus, yes, of course, I had not doubted. Snape is on the right side. The right side, Lapin, is your side, which is mine. You will go to him. You will read with him. You will not tell him anything about us that he did not already know, but you may answer his questions in the small, clean way that I taught you. He will see you. He will love you in the manner of a man who has loved nothing else. Let him. The 11 you describe is correct. The Parkinson is a pansy. She will be a friend to you. The Malfoy is a Draco. He will not be a friend. He will be a thing you have, like a watch. The Greengrass is a Daphne. She is your kin on the black side by the small clean marriage. The Davis is a Tracy. She is half-blood, and you may treat her so, that is, with the small, unweighted courtesy. The Bulstrode is a Millicent. Her grandmother was a Yaxley. The Zabini is a Blaze. His mother is not yet on her 7th husband. The Goyle is a Goyle, and the Crabbe is a Crabbe. You may pat them on the shoulder when it is necessary, and otherwise leave them be. The bed is soft, you say. Sleep, then, sleep on it. Sleep deeply and without dreaming the small bench dreams of our cell. The cell is here. I am on the bench. The bench is warm because I have begun to walk myself to it in the evening. Holcomb came past last night. He nodded. I will tell you in the next letter what I have not yet told you. He is on his way. He will not come this year. He will come perhaps in the 3rd or the 4th, but he is coming. Walk carefully, my boy. Voldemort will come. I love you, Lapin. The line goes on. B. The boy read the letter on the morning of the 7th, in the small, green-lit common room before the others were up, by a fire that Snape had taught him, on the 2nd night of the reading, to set without a wand by the small, clean back-of-throat swallow. He read it once. He read it a 2nd time. He put it in the lining of his robe. In the inside pocket the elder Knot had had a Wiltshire tailor sew in on the morning of the 3rd of August for exactly this purpose. And he sat for a long time in the wing chair in front of the fire, in the way he had been told his aunt had sat in the wing chair in front of the fire in 1976, with his long legs uncrossed and his hair in 2 small black ropes over his shoulders. He had not, in those weeks since his haircut at the elder Knots, allowed it to be cut again. He walked carefully. He walked carefully through his first year and his second and his third. He did not, in those years, take a single point away from his house by inattention. He took, by his work, 438 in his first year, and 479 in his second, and 503 in his third, which was the highest yearly total any Slytherin first, second, or third year had taken since Lucius Malfoy in 1968-1971, and which was, by 1994, a small private joke among the Slytherin upper years, who had begun in his second year to call him, when they wished to compliment him, Salazar, and when they wished to mock him gently, Bellatrix. He took the mockery in the small, careful way. He did not change by the small flick of an expression when it was applied to him, and he made, on 3 small occasions, the people who applied it to him without affection feel, in the small, clean Lestrange way, that they had been impolite. They were impolite, after that, only to one another. He was devastating in defense against the dark arts. He was devastating in Dada in his first year, because the boy who taught Dada in his first year was a soft, round man called Quirinus Quirrell, who had a small parasite living in the back of his head. And the parasite was, although nobody in the room knew it yet, a thin, pale fragment of the Lord that Bellatrix had been writing about in her letter. And the parasite in the back of Quirrell's head, on the first morning of the boys' first Dada class, on the 2nd of September, looked out through Quirrell's eyes at the boy in the back row and saw, in a green that the parasite had not seen in 11 years, the green that had been the last thing the parasite had seen before going into the long dark of the cottage at Godric's Hollow. And the parasite, in the back of Quirrell's head, began very faintly to scream. Quirrell took a step back. Quirrell put his hand on the desk. Quirrell said, in the small stammered voice that he had begun to cultivate as cover, "Gee, good morning, C-class." The boy in the back row, who had spent the prior 11 years listening to a woman in 2 black ropes describe to him, in the long lullaby voice, exactly what the Lord smelled like at his Lord's strongest, looked at Quirrell across the greenlit room, and he knew, the way a boy who has been told a thing all his life knows when he has met it for the first time, exactly what was at the back of Quirrell's head. He wrote his aunt that night. He wrote, "A.B. Quirrell has him in the back of his head." She wrote back the next morning by the slow, "Lapin, do not approach, do not engage, watch only. If he speaks to you alone, leave the room. If he reaches for you, shield. He cannot in that state harm you. He is only the small piece of him. The whole of him will come later. Do not, by any small careless action this year, give the small piece any reason to communicate to the whole that he has met a thing he should remember." Be the boy obeyed. He watched. He did not, in the whole of his first year, attract Quirrell's particular attention. He sat in the back of the Dada classroom, in the small, careful black way, with his hands in his lap and his head an inch lower than was expected. And he answered the questions on the small exercises that Quirrell set them, and he answered them by the small, careful coaching of the elder Knot, who had written him a 6-page letter in October on this exact matter, just slightly worse than he was actually capable of, so that the parasite at the back of Quirrell's head would, on flipping through the papers in the back of Quirrell's office in the late evening, see only a small, clean Slytherin who was, perhaps, a year behind. The boy ranked 6th in Dada in his first-year examination. He came first in everything else. He took the house cup home for Slytherin in a small, careful, private way, by a margin of 41 points, and the small, thin, pale Slytherin head of house looked at him at the end-of-year feast, across the green-lit table, and said in a voice no one but the boy could hear, "Mr. Potter, we will speak in the summer." They did not, in the end, speak in the summer, because the boy spent the summer at the elder Knots, and the small, thin, pale Slytherin head of house had a long, quiet July of his own at his own house. But the boy and Snape did, in the second year, begin the small, careful, private program that Snape had been planning all the prior June. The program was, on its face, advanced potions. In fact, it was a program in advanced everything. Snape taught him, in those Tuesday and Friday afternoons in the dungeon laboratory, the small, careful Snape arts that Snape had spent his own life on. Legilimency, which the boy already had in the small black way by his aunt's lap. He learned with Snape the small careful arts of looking back, brewing under duress, the small private spellcraft that Snape had developed in his own years in the corner of the Hogwarts library. The small, clean dark arts inversions that Snape had used on 3 small, careful occasions in the late 1970s, and at the end of the 3rd year. The small, careful spell that Snape had been working at for a decade, and which he taught only to the boy, in the way one teaches the last of a line, the silent patroness of the doe, which Snape did not, in the lesson, ever fully cast in front of the boy, but which he taught him in pieces, the way one teaches a thing one cannot bear to perform whole. The boy was devastating in Dada in his 2nd year, because the Dada teacher in his 2nd year was a fraud called Lockhart. And the boy, who had been raised to recognize a fraud at 12 paces by the small private inventories of the sacred 28 that his aunt had taught him to keep, simply, in his 2nd year, did not bother with Lockhart. And the boy and Lockhart entered into a small, careful, tacit arrangement by which the boy submitted his exercises in the small, clean handwriting Lockhart liked, and Lockhart awarded him the small public marks that Lockhart awarded everyone, and they both went their ways. He was devastating in Dada in his 3rd year, because the Dada teacher in his 3rd year was Remus John Lupin, who recognized, on the first afternoon of the 1st class, the small Lestrange cut of the way the boy held his shoulders, and who had been told by Albus Dumbledore on the night of his arrival at the school, the careful version of the boy's history that the school had agreed to circulate. And Lupin, on the 2nd afternoon of the 1st class, kept the boy back and said, in the kind voice that Lupin used on his small, careful Slytherin, who was the son of his old friend, Mr. Potter, "May I have a word?" The boy said, "Sir." Lupin said, "I knew your father." The boy said, "I have been told, sir." Lupin said, "I knew your mother." The boy said, "I have been told, sir." Lupin said in the kind voice, "Mr. Potter, I have also met your aunt." The boy did not, at this, change his expression by the small flick of any small muscle. He had been taught since he was 4 that the small flick of any small muscle was the way one gave one's self away in conversation. He said in his quiet voice, "Sir, which one?" Lupin laughed very lightly, the way Lupin laughed at the small, clean things that the boy said. Lupin said, "Bellatrix." The boy said, "Then, sir, I do not believe you. My Aunt Bella has not seen any wizard but Snape in 9 years. Lupin said, "I met her in 1976. I dueled her in the Hogwarts corridor at 9:30 at night outside the kitchens, and she stripped my wand from me, and she held it up to my face, and she said," and Lupin's eyes, for the first time in the small, careful 3rd-year Dada classroom, went somewhere else. "Well, never mind," the boy said in his quiet voice. "Sir, what did she say?" Lupin said, "She said, 'Take care of yourself, Wolf. The world is going to be very unkind to you.'" The boy looked at him for a long moment. He said, "That sounds like her." Lupin said, "Yes." The boy said, "Thank you for telling me." Lupin said, "Mr. Potter." The boy said, "Sir." Lupin said, if you ever need to talk to someone about any small thing, about the cell, about her, about your father," the boy said in his quiet voice, "Sir, with respect, my father is dead, my aunt is alive, the cell is gone, I have nothing to talk about." Lupin said, "I understand." The boy said, "Sir, thank you, may I go?" He went. He went in the small, careful black step to the door. And at the door he stopped, with one small Lestrange hand on the frame, and he turned, and he said in his quiet voice, "Sir, the thing she did in the corridor at 9:30 at night outside the kitchens, when she stripped your wand, was that the line of no, palm flat, finger spread, or was that the black snap with the 3rd finger leading?" Lupin said, "It was the line of number." The boy said, "Then you were lucky, sir." He went. He dueled in his 3rd year in the small Dada dueling circle that Lupin set up on the last Friday of each month for the 7th and 6th years, and into which the boy, by Lupin's small, careful arrangement, was on the 3rd Friday of October invited as a 13-year-old, and he beat on that Friday in 17 seconds a 7th year called Roper, who had been the Slytherin dueling champion for 2 years, and on the 3rd Friday of November in 12 seconds, a 6th-year Ravenclaw called Forbes, who had been the school dueling champion the previous year, and on the 3rd Friday of December in 9 seconds, a 7th-year Gryffindor called Wood, who was the brother-in-law of Halcombe and whose nephew, in the small, careful inventory of Bellatrix Lestrange's prophecies, was already wanted on a broom by Puddlemere. And after the 7th Friday, on which the boy had beaten in 23 seconds 3 sixth-years simultaneously, in a small private exhibition Lupin had arranged for the visiting Aura Committee, the small private exhibition stopped by an agreement of the headmaster, the head of Slytherin, and the Dada professor, who had all together decided, in a small careful meeting in the staff room on the second Sunday after Easter, that the boy's dueling should not, for the rest of his 3rd year, be publicly displayed. He had not lifted his hand in the corridor of the school. He had only lifted it in the dueling circle. He had not, in his 3rd year, cracked a flagstone. He had not, in his 3rd year, in fact, cast a single reducto. He had been told in the second letter of the 1st year by his aunt that the reducto was for the matters of the cell only, and that the matters of the school were the matters of the wand. And he had, for 3 years, kept the small, clean wand that the elder Knot had given him on the morning of the 1st of September of his 1st year. The cousin's wand, which was a wand of holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, which had been the wand of an elder Knot in 1791 who had been called Theodore and who had died of typhus in his 2nd year, and had passed the wand to his cousin Aldous, and which had been kept in the Knot house ever since, for whichever Knot boy was a Theodore in his 1st year, in his sleeve, and he had cast all his year's magic with it, in the wand way, in the small, clean, public way that the school required. He kept the cell magics in the cell. He kept the school magics in the school. He wrote her every Sunday. He wrote her every Sunday in the cell quiet hand on brown paper by the small wick of a candle. On the first letter he sent her the small line in the bottom right that he had taken to signing his letters with, a small careful drawing of a raven, head down, no larger than his fingernail, and he sent the letters by the slow, by the elder Knot, by Holcomb. He told her in those letters everything. The small careful Snape, the soft round Quirrell, the fraud Lockhart, the kind Lupin, the small careful Draco who was a watch and not a friend, the small careful Pansy who was a friend, the small careful Daphne who was a kin. He told her on the morning of the 11th of December of his 1st year that the parasite had quit Quirrell on the night of the 10th, in the 3rd corridor on the 3rd floor, in a small careful incident in which the boy had not, although tempted, been involved, and the parasite had gone out the window in the form of a small black thread, and the school had stopped, very briefly, talking about Quirrell, and the headmaster had given the boy a small careful chocolate on the morning of the 12th. She wrote back every Wednesday. She wrote back in the long black calligraphy on the brown paper Thaddeus brought her, the small careful instructions and the small careful affections, and at the bottom, sometimes, the line that the boy had begun in his 2nd year to know would always come at the bottom. Walk carefully, my boy. He is coming. He is not yet at the door, but he is on the road. She wrote it again in the spring of his 2nd year. He is on the road. She wrote it again in the autumn of his 3rd year. He is at the inn. She wrote it again on the morning of the 7th of June of his 3rd year, in the small letter she sent by Thaddeus the morning before he sat his last paper. He is at the door, Lapin. Walk carefully. He walked carefully. He went home for the summer to the Knot house. He spent the summer reading, in the small library on the 2nd floor, the small careful books that the elder Knot had been laying out for him since the spring. The books were of Lestrange family magic in the long forms, of Black Tether in the long forms, of the small private dueling arts of the sacred 28 as they had been taught between 1601 and 1734, before the ministry had begun to require wand-only practice, and the boy read them in the small green-lit library of the elder Knot with his small Lestrange hands at his sides and his head an inch lower than was expected. And on the night of the 7th of August, in the small drawing-room in front of a fire, the elder Knot said to him, in the small careful voice in which the elder Knot said everything important, "Boy, he is coming. He will be at the school by Christmas. He will not be the parasite. He will be the whole of him by the small careful means that his servants have arranged. You will this year meet him." The boy said, "I know." The elder Knot said, "She has told you." The boy said, "She has told me." The elder Knot said, "And," the boy said, "I will walk carefully." The elder Knot said, "Good." He went back up to Hogwarts on the 1st of September of his 4th year, on the slow train from London, with the small carved horse of bone in his pocket, And he sat again in the compartment with Theodore Nott, and with Crabbe and Goyle, and with Daphne Greengrass, and with Tracy Davis. And he read on the train Magical Hereditary Theory by Lavender Dumfries, the small, careful Slytherin-only book that the elder Nott had bought him on the morning of the 31st of August. And at Crewe he looked up from his book, and he looked at Theodore Nott's chin, and he said in his quiet voice, "Cousin." Theodore said, "Cousin." The boy said, "Thank your father." Theodore said, "He has thanked yours." The boy went up to the school for his 4th year. Chapter 6, The Graveyard. The 4th year was the year of the Triwizard Tournament. It came into Hogwarts in the 2nd week of September. In the long, careful pageantry the school did for these things, the ships and the carriages, the Beauxbatons girls in pale blue, the Durmstrang boys in red, and the boy watched it from the small green-lit window of the Slytherin common room with the small careful inattention he had practiced by now for 3 years. He had been told by his aunt, in the letter that had come up by the Slough on the morning of the 15th, that the tournament was the means. The tournament, his aunt had written in the long black calligraphy, is the means by which the Lord is to come back into his body, and you are the small clean piece of him that he needs for the coming back, and you are to be put into the tournament without your consent, and the tournament is to take you in the last task to the place where they have his cauldron. You will not, Lapin, refuse to go. You will go. You will go because going is the way you find out what the Lord wants, and the way the Lord finds out what you are. You will go into the cauldron place, and you will let the small ritual happen, and you will be patient, and you will, when the moment comes, do what we have practiced. He had written back the same Sunday, A.B. what we have practiced. She had written back by Thaddeus, C. Yes, the duel, the cold thing, the line of no, palm flat, fingers spread, and the small back of throat swallow. You will hold the line of no on him for the time it takes him to ask the question. You will answer the question. You will answer it the way I have taught you. You will answer it with the small black truth, the truth that he will not believe, and that will, for 1 second, stop him, because it is too small a truth for him to have expected. The second is yours. You will use it for the disengage and the apparition. He will not, on the spot of his returning, be in a state to chase you. He will not yet, in the first hour of his returning, have all his power. He will hesitate. He will, in the hesitation, let you go. You will come by the long route, by the small careful arrangement that the elder Nott has been making for you to the island. You will come to me. Walk carefully, my boy. He had written back on the next Sunday, A.B. I will not yet apparate to the island, I think. I am not yet of the age. I will use the small, careful porting stone that the elder Nott has been preparing. She had written back by Holcomb, see, the porting stone is good. The porting stone is better. The line goes on. He had read the letter, and he had folded it, and he had put it in the inside pocket of his robe, and he had walked carefully through the autumn of his 4th year, and he had let the tournament take him. His name came out of the goblet on the night of the 30th of October, in the great hall, in the careful theatrical way that the goblet did these things, and the hall went quiet. In the small expectant way the hall had gone quiet for him 3 years before in the line under the hat, and the boy stood up from the Slytherin table, and he walked in the careful black step to the front of the hall, and he went into the small antechamber, and he stood there in his small, bony Lestrange-cut robes with his hands at his sides, and his head an inch lower than was expected. And Bartemius Crouch the elder, in the antechamber, said in the dry voice that he used at all his ministry pronouncements, "Mr. Potter, is this a thing of your doing?" The boy said, "No, sir." Crouch said, "Do you know whose doing it is?" The boy said, "Yes, sir." Crouch said, "And?" The boy said, "Sir, with respect, I will not in the antechamber name him." Crouch said, "You will tell me his name." The boy said, "No, sir." Crouch said, "Boy." The boy said in his quiet voice, "Sir, with respect, I am a 4th year. The man whose name I am not naming is a man whose name your son knew. If you would like the name, you may go to your son and ask him for it. I will not, in this room, in the hearing of the people who are at the door, give it to you. If you press me, sir, I will give you the small black answer that we give to questions of this kind, which is the answer that my aunt would give you in the cell, and the answer is that you are an old man and I am a small boy, and the small boy who is in the small room with the old man and the old man's wand, and the old man's wand pointing at the small boy's chest, is the boy who is in this small room in the position of strength. I will go now." He went. Crouch did not follow him. Crouch stood for a long moment in the antechamber, with his small wand in his hand at half-mast in front of him, and he thought of his son, whom he had given to the Dementors in 1982, and whom he had been told the previous Friday by his small, careful Aura friend at the ministry, was no longer in fact in the cell at Azkaban he had been given. And Crouch thought, in the small antechamber on the night of the 30th of October, that his world was not the world he had thought. On the morning of the 28th, that he was living in, and he sat down on the small wooden bench by the wall, and he put his head in his hands, and he sat there for an hour before he came out. And by the time he came out, the boy was gone, and the boy was sitting in the Slytherin common room with the small carved horse of bone in his pocket, and his small Lestrange hands flat on the small green table in front of the fire, with Theodore not next to him, and Pansy Parkinson on the other side, and Daphne Greengrass with her chin on the back of Theodore Nott's chair. And the four of them, in the small green-lit common room, were saying nothing to each other, and were saying everything by the small, careful flick of small, careful muscle. He went through the 3 tasks the way one goes through 3 tasks, in order, with care, and without telling the audience anything. He went through the dragon in November by the small, careful black summoning that his aunt had taught him at 6 on the bench, which is not a summoning of a thing but a summoning of an animal's small, careful sleep. And the dragon slept for 3 minutes on the rocks, and he took the egg in the dueling circle and walked off the field, and the crowd did not, in those 3 minutes, breathe. He went through the lake in February by the small, careful black water walking that his aunt had taught him at 7 on the floor of the cell. The cell had a small, clean rim of standing water along its eastern wall in March of his 6th year, and the rim had taught him the small black water walking on the small, careful day his aunt had brought him into it. And he came up out of the lake at the 83rd minute with the small, clean Cedric Diggory in his arms, and not in his arms, the small, careful Ronald Weasley that Dumbledore had thought he would bring up, because the boy had been told by Pansy Parkinson on the morning of the 23rd that the small thing in the lake that mattered most to him was, in fact, in the lake, and the small thing in the lake that mattered most to him was a sealed brown letter from his aunt that the small ritual of the lake had taken on the morning of the 22nd from the inside of his robe in the dormitory, and Dumbledore had, at the end of task ceremony, looked at him in a way that meant that Dumbledore was now, for the first time since 1981, beginning to understand what the boy had become. The boy on the field did not look back at Dumbledore. He looked at Cedric. He said in his cell-quiet voice, "Cedric, thank you for waiting." Cedric said, "Thank you, Potter, for coming." Cedric had been in the second task, a small, clean Hufflepuff in pale yellow trim who had come up to the boy in the small green-lit corridor outside the Slytherin common room on the morning of the 17th of December, and had said in his cell-quiet boy's voice, "Potter, I am the other Hogwarts champion. I think we should help each other. They want us to be enemies. I think we should be a small, clean Hogwarts pair." The boy had looked at him for a long moment and had said, "Diggory, I accept, within the rules of the tournament. We are allies." They had been allies through the second task, and through the third they had practiced in the small dueling room on the 7th floor that the castle had given them by request, the small, careful joint work of 2 duelists. And the boy had taught Cedric, on the 3rd evening of their practice, the small black step that allowed a duelist to retire from a fight without losing his back. And Cedric had taught the boy the small Hufflepuff plant magic that allowed a duelist to come up out of a maze with the small wave of a hand and a smell of crushed mint. He went through the maze in June by the small, careful black map that his aunt had taught him at 9 on the cell floor, by the small, careful drawing of the cracked flagstones, and which had taught him, by long practice, the small, clean mental art of knowing where the corner is in a place he had not seen before. He met Cedric at the very center of the maze. They stood in the green-lit gloom at the cup, and they had agreed in the practice room in March that they would take the cup together by the small, careful joint clasp on the rim. And Cedric had said on the night of the agreement, in his cell-quiet voice, "Potter, If anything goes wrong, if the cup is perhaps not the cup we expect, you will let go of it. You will let go of it and I will go on. I am older, I am stronger. You will not, if there is a thing wrong with the cup, go where it takes us. And the boy had said in his quiet voice, Diggory, thank you, I will however go where it takes us. You have been good to me. I will not, if it takes me, leave you to it alone. We will, if it takes us, go together. And Cedric had nodded. The cup took them. The cup took them, on the night of the 24th of June, off the field, and off the maze, and off the school, and out across a long dark distance that the boy felt go past him in the small back-of-throat way that the elder Knot had taught him to feel the small careful jumps of a portkey. And they landed in a graveyard in tall grass in the dim of an early summer night, and the cup rolled away from them along the wet stone of an old tomb, and Cedric, beside him, said in his quiet voice, Harry, where? He did not finish. He did not finish because, in the small, careful arrangement that the Lord had made through his small, careful servants, the small, thin man in the robe who had been waiting in the graveyard for 6 minutes, the small, thin man who was, although the boy did not know it on landing, Peter Pettigrew, of whom Bellatrix had written in her letter of the 3rd of November in the 2nd year, in the small, careful black inventory of the Lord's surviving servants, said, in the small, thin voice of a man who has been given a small, clear instruction, kill the spare. The boy moved. He had been raised, since the age of 7, to move when a small, thin voice in a dim place said the words of an instruction. He moved before the small, thin man had finished the 3rd word. He moved by the small, careful black step that took a duelist out of his own line. And he took Cedric with him by the small, clean clasp on the wrist that the elder Knot had taught him in the spring of the 3rd year in the corridor of the Knot house, by the small, careful drill against the elder Knot's own wand. And the green light from the small, thin man's wand went past where Cedric's chest had been, and it went into the tomb behind them. And the tomb cracked along the long line of its slab 18 inches. He said in his quiet voice in the dim of the graveyard, Cedric, run! Cedric said, Harry, the boy said, run. There is a black path north along the wall. Hagrid is at the north corner of the wall by my aunt's arrangement. He has the spare portkey. Go, I will come. Cedric said, Harry, I'm not going to, the boy said in the quiet voice that he had used in the corridor of cell 14 on the morning of the 1st of August. Cedric, with respect, go, I have prepared this. I have been preparing this for 3 years. I will come. If I do not come, you will tell the school what I told you. Go, now. Cedric went. He went the way Cedric had been taught to go by his small, clean Hufflepuff father, which was the way a Hufflepuff who has been told to go by a friend goes, at a flat sprint, low to the wall, hand on the stone, in the small, clean Hufflepuff line that 9 generations of Diggories had taught their sons. He cleared the wall in 27 seconds. He cleared the corner in 51. He met Hagrid at the north of the wall in 76. Hagrid was there by the small, careful arrangement of the elder Knot, who had been told by the boy on the morning of the 15th of June what the boy thought, by his small, careful reading of the autumn's incidents, was going to happen on the night of the 24th, and who had arranged with Hagrid through a small, clean intermediary in the small, careful Hogwarts way, for Hagrid to be at the north corner of the wall of the graveyard at Little Hengleton on the night of the 24th at the time the cup was likely to land. Hagrid did not ask Cedric anything. Hagrid took Cedric by the back of the robe, and he put the small, careful portkey, which was a tin spoon, the same tin spoon Thaddeus had brought up to cell 14 in 1985, by the small, careful loan that the elder Knot had arranged in the 3rd year into Cedric's hand, and Cedric went, in the small, careful blue-green flash that the portkey gave, back to the field at Hogwarts, and he landed in the center of the maze clearing, alone with the cup on the grass beside him. At 26 minutes past 9 on the night of the 24th of June, 1995, and the audience saw him land, and the audience saw in the next moment that he was alone, and the audience went, in the careful theatrical way of all audiences that have lost their second champion, very quiet. In the graveyard in the dim, the small, thin man in the robe said, You will come here. The boy said, I will come. He came in the small, careful black step. He came with his small Lestrange hands at his sides and his head an inch lower than was expected, and he stood before the small, thin man, and he looked at the small, thin man's chin, not the eyes. The small, thin man said, Boy, the master is in the cauldron. You will stand for the ritual. The boy said, "I will stand." He stood. He let the small, thin man cut from his right forearm the small, careful slice that the ritual required. He let the small, thin man take the small, careful red bead of his blood into the cauldron. He stood in the dim of the graveyard with his small, bony Lestrange cut robes around him and his small Lestrange palms open against his sides. And he watched the small, thin man cut his own hand off into the cauldron in the small, careful, sacrificial way the ritual required. And the small, thin man's hand fell into the cauldron. And the cauldron boiled, and the cauldron screamed, and out of the cauldron, in the small, careful theater of all such rituals, the small, thin, pale shape rose in the steam, into the body that he had not had since 1981. The Lord stepped out of the cauldron naked, and accepted from the small, thin man a small black robe, and put the robe on, and turned, and looked across the dim of the graveyard at the boy. He had no nose. He had cat pupils. He had the small, careful, pale face of a riddle whose body had been resewn in cauldron steam. He smiled. He said in the small, bright voice that Bellatrix Lestrange had described to the boy at the age of 6, on the bench in the dim of the cell, the voice that was in the description, the voice that the small, careful black ear could not on any account mistake, Harry Potter. The boy said in his cell-quiet voice, "My lord." The Lord said, You call me my lord." The boy said, "Yes." The Lord laughed. The Lord laughed in the small, bright way the Lord laughed at the small, private jokes of the Lord. The laugh that Bellatrix had once heard in 1979 at the sandalwood table among the apple trees, and had told the boy on the bench in the cell in 1987, was the laugh she should have on hearing "killed him for." And the laugh, in the dim of the graveyard, went between the tombs the way the laugh went between things that had been alive once. And the small, thin man in the robe held his bleeding wrist to his chest and bowed. The Lord said, "You are well-mannered, boy." The boy said, "My lord, I have been raised well." The Lord said, "I see." The Lord, in the dim, walked once around the boy. In the small, careful, theatrical way the Lord did these things. And the boy stood in the dual form, in the small Lestrange dual form, weight on the back foot, hands open at the sides, eyes lowered to the chin. And the Lord, in the third turn of his walk, came to a small, careful halt in front of the boy and looked at him for the first time at close range. And the Lord saw in the dim of the graveyard the small, careful black step, and the small, careful Lestrange shoulder, and the small, careful black hair, and the small, careful Lestrange chin, and the small, careful pale face that was the small, careful pale face that all the Lord's careful selections wore. And the Lord said in the small, bright voice, "Boy, who taught you to stand like that?" The boy said, "Aunt Bella." He said it in the small, cell-quiet voice. He said it the way one says the true thing one has been told to say on a small, careful evening in the small, careful place where the true thing has been waiting for the question. He said it without inflection. He said it with the small, careful, raised upper lip at one corner, the way Bellatrix Lestrange set her mouth in the cell when everything in the world was a small and faintly amusing offense against her, the way the boy had been setting his mouth in the corridors of Hogwarts for 3 years. The Lord did not, at first, move. The Lord stood in the dim of the graveyard, in the small black robe, with his small bright cat pupils on the boy, and the Lord was, for the first time since 1981, surprised. He had not been surprised in 14 years. He had not been surprised on the night of the cottage. He had not been surprised at the dispersing of his body across the Albanian woodland. He had not been surprised at the small, careful return through Quirrell, or at the small, careful arrangement of the diary, or at the small, careful, long arrangement of the cauldron. He was surprised now. He was surprised because the boy in front of him had said the name of the Lord's most loyal lieutenant in the small, cell-quiet way the Lord had heard the lieutenant herself say it, with the small, careful, raised upper lip at one corner, and the Lord had not, in any of his small, careful planning of the night, prepared for the answer. He hesitated. He hesitated for 1 second. It was 1 second too long. The boy moved. He moved by the small, careful black step that took a duelist out of his own line, and the line of no came up off his palm in the small Lestrange way, the flat, clean, cold plane the size of a hand, and he held it on the Lord's chest the way one holds a hand against a closing door, and the Lord, in the small, careful surprise of the night, said, "What? The boy said in his quiet voice, "My lord, Aunt Bella has been preparing me for a long time to answer 2 questions. The first you have asked. The second you will ask now. I will answer it. The second is, what would she want me to do?" The Lord said in the small, bright voice. "What?" The boy said. "She would want me to go home." He paid for the apparition on the back of the throat in the small, clean Lestrange way the elder knot had taught him in March. The boy was not yet, by the law, of an apparition age, but he had been taught in the small, careful knot-house way, the small black variant of the apparition that did not, in its small, clean execution, take account of the legal age. The small black variant being the variant by which a black who had been taught the small, clean back-of-throat swallow by her aunt at 6 in a cell could go, by the small, careful focus on a small, carved horse of bone in her pocket, anywhere on the map that her aunt had drawn in the cell, including, in this case, the small gray morning of the island of Azkaban itself, where the small carved horse had been carved. He went in the small, clean, blue-green flash of the apparition, in the dim of the graveyard, before the Lord had had time to fire the first curse. He took on the back of his throat the small, careful pain of the apparition at 14. The pain that the elder knot had told him would, on the first try, be the pain of a small, careful knife along the bottom of the tongue. And the pain came up and went down, and he landed on the small, careful patch of bare rock on the eastern landing of Azkaban at 29 minutes past 9 on the night of the 24th of June, 1995, and his knees on landing gave way, and he went down on the rock in the small, wet sea spray of the Azkaban evening. And the boat from Wick was, by Hulkum's small, careful arrangement, tied up on the landing, and Hulkum himself was on the landing with his wand out, and Hulkum, on seeing the small, careful blue-green flash of the apparition and the small, bony Lestrange, cut shape of the boy on the rock, said in his quiet voice, "Mr. Potter." The boy said, "Hulkum." He coughed. He coughed up the small, careful bead of his own blood that the back-of-throat apparition, at 14, had taken in payment. He said, "Take me to her." Hulkum took him to her. He took him up the long stair of the women's tier, in the small, careful Hulkum way, with the wand on the steps in front of them and the boy on the stair behind. And Hulkum opened, with his small, careful key, the door of cell 14, and the boy walked in the small, careful black step, with his small, bony Lestrange hands at his sides and his head an inch lower than was expected, and Bellatrix Lestrange on the bench, who had been sitting for an hour on the bench in the dim, with the small bracket above the bench holding 3 stubs of pencil and a stack of brown paper, looked up, and the boy of 14 on the cracked flagstone in front of the bench said in his quiet voice, "Aunt Bella, I have come back. He is alive. Cedric is at the school. He hesitated. I went." She did not say anything. She did not need to. She got off the bench, and she crossed the cell, and she went down on the cracked flagstone in front of the boy, and she put both her arms around him, and she put her face into his hair, which had been cut in the small, careful Slytherin way by Pansy Parkinson on the morning of the 3rd of June, but which had grown back by the small, careful black method into the 2 small ropes, and she said into the top of his head in her low voice, the voice the hall at Hogwarts had not heard since 1972 and would not hear by the boy's small, careful arrangement for the next 8 years, "My beautiful boy." He said in his quiet voice, "Aunt Bella." She said, "You did the cold thing." He said, "I did the cold thing." She said, "He let you go." He said, "He let me go." She said, "He will come for me." He said, "I know." She said, "Lappin, he will be here in the morning. He will send the men." He said, "I know." She said, "And," he said in his quiet voice, "Aunt Bella, we will not be here in the morning." Chapter 7 The Breakout, and Albania they came on the dawn. The Lord, in his small, careful arrangement of the night, had sent the men in the 2nd hour after his return. The 3 brothers Lestrange, Rodolphus on the men's tier, Rabistan on the men's tier, the elder bound by oath but now free by the small careful return of the body of the master, and the 2 Carrows and the elder Macnair and Augustus Rookwood and Antonin Dolohov, and a small clean half-handful of the lesser servants whose names the boy had been told in the cell in the long black inventory of his 8th year, but whose faces the boy had not yet, in the dim gray morning of the 25th of June, seen. The Lord had not himself come. The Lord had not come because the Lord, in the small, careful theater of his return, did not wish on the first morning to be seen on the rocks of Azkaban. The Lord wished to be seen on the lawns at Malfoy Manor on the morning of the 26th, with his lieutenant on his right hand and her ward on his left, in the small, careful pageantry of the new world. He had sent his men. The men came in by the eastern, landing in 3 boats from the small, careful Albanian fishing port that the elder Rookwood had been maintaining since 1979. And they came up the long stair in the small, careful Death Eater step. And they came along the corridor of the second tier of the women's wing in the small, careful black robes of the night's work. And they stopped at the door of cell 14, where they had been told the small, careful key was, and where they had been told, by the small, careful arrangement of Bartemius, Crouch the Younger from the basement of the elder Crouch's house in Wiltshire, that the corridor would be empty of guards at the hour of dawn, and that the small, careful door would be open. The corridor was empty of guards, the door was open, the cell was empty, the bench had no blanket on the floor behind it, the bracket above the bench had no pencils on it. The cracked flagstone in front of the bench was a single cracked flagstone. There was no boy. There was no Bellatrix Lestrange. There was in the middle of the cracked flagstone a small carved horse of bone set upright on its hooves. There was, beneath the small carved horse of bone, a piece of brown paper. The piece of brown paper, in the small, clean, cell-quiet hand that the elder Rodolphus Lestrange did not recognize, but that the elder Rookwood recognized on the second reading from the small, careful black calligraphy of 1715, said, "To the servants of the Lord, we are not here. We will not be here. We do not in the end belong to him. We never have. The line of black, when she has been a mother for 14 years, does not. Tell him we send our regards. She has been mad, and I have made her well." The brothers Lestrange did not, on the reading, speak. The elder Rookwood, who had read it, put it in his pocket. The 2 Carrows looked at each other. Macnair lifted his small, careful axe and let it down again. Dolohov said in his small, careful voice, "He has taken her." Rodolphus said in his small, careful voice, "Who has taken whom?" Rookwood said, "The boy has taken her." Rabistan said, "How?" Rookwood said, "By the small, careful black map, by the carving, by the back of the throat." Rodolphus said, "He is 14. Rookwood said, "He is the son of a Lestrange." Rodolphus said, "He is the son of a Potter." Rookwood said in the small, careful voice, "Rodolphus, with respect, he is the son of your wife." There was a long silence in the cell. Rodolphus did not, in the end, say anything. He stood for a long moment in the middle of cell 14, with the cracked flagstone at his feet and the small carved horse of bone in his hand, and he thought of his wife, whom he had not seen in 14 years, and whom he had loved in the small, careful way the Lestranges loved their wives since the night of the wedding in 1971, when she had stood at the altar of the Lestrange chapel in the long white robe, with her hair in 2 ropes over her shoulders, and had said, in the small, careful black voice that had made him in 1971 sure of his life, "Yes, I will." He put the horse in his coat pocket. He turned. He said, "We will not pursue." Rookwood said, "The Lord will require," Rodolphus said, "The Lord will require what the Lord requires. We will not pursue. She is not his to take back. She has been a mother. She has been a mother for 14 years. The line that goes on comes back. The boy is hers. He is not ours. He is not yours. He is not the Lord's. He is hers. We will go now." They went. They went down the stair in the small, careful Death Eater step, and they got into their 3 boats, and they went back to the small, careful Albanian fishing port. And Rookwood, on the small, careful crossing, watched the eastern landing of Azkaban recede behind them in the grey morning. And he saw, on the far rocks, in the small, careful sea spray, no one and the boy and his aunt. In the small, careful blue-green flash of an apparition that the boy had paid for on the back of the throat at 29 minutes, past dawn on the 25th of June, 1995, were already, in that moment, 600 miles away on the coast of Brittany, in a small, careful house that the elder Knot had been keeping for them since the boy's 3rd year, with a fire in the grate and a kettle on, and a small, clean Hufflepuff letter from Cedric Diggory on the small table by the window that said, in the small, clean Diggory hand, "Harry, I made it. Tell your aunt I am alive. Be careful. See, they did not stay in Brittany. They stayed 3 nights. They stayed 3 nights for the boy to teach his aunt, on the small, careful Brittany rocks. The small, clean trick of standing in a sea wind without the small back-of-spine shudder that a woman who has been 14 years in a cell takes when the sea wind first comes over her face. And they stayed 3 nights for the boy's aunt to teach the boy in the small, careful Brittany kitchen. The small, careful Lestrange table magics that one used when one wished to have, in the small, careful evening, a small, careful meal at home. And they stayed 3 nights for the elder, not small, careful house elf, who had been at the house for 10 weeks in the elder, not small, careful arrangement, to prepare for them the small, careful papers in a small, careful name that the elder not had been preparing for them, in the long, careful black way since the boy's 4th year. The name was Bellatrix and Corvus Rosier, the small, careful family name that Bellatrix had taken from her Aunt Drula's house in 1957, and had kept all her life in the small back corner of her mind, in case in the small, careful longer way of these things, she would one day need to be a Rosier. And the boy in the small, careful Brittany evening accepted the name Rosier in the small, careful black way, by the small, careful raised upper lip at one corner and the small, clean, quiet voice. They went south. They went south by the small, careful slow route the elder not had been mapping for them since the boy's 1st year. By Brittany, by the small, careful Loire Valley, by the small, careful Massif Central, by the small, careful Côte d'Azur, by the small, careful long crossing into the Italian peninsula at the small, careful coast port of Ventimiglia. And on the morning of the 3rd of August, 1995, they crossed by the small, careful long crossing into the small, careful Albanian woodland that the Lord had in 1981 used for the small, careful dispersal of his body, and which was, in the small, careful black way, the small, careful safest place for them on the continent, because no servant of the Lord would, in the small, careful Lord time of the Lord's return, willingly go back to the place of the Lord's long unhappiness. They walked into the small, careful Albanian woodland on the 3rd of August, 1995, in the small, careful rosier robes. They went up the small, careful valley to the small, careful clearing where the elder, not small, careful house elf had, in the small, careful way, been preparing them a small, careful house since the boy's 3rd year. They built the small, careful house in the small, careful Albanian way over the next 8 years. It was not, at first, a manor. It was, at first, a small, careful Brittany-style cottage, on a small, careful Albanian foundation, with 2 rooms and a kitchen and a small, careful garden out the back. They lived in it, in the small, careful rosier way, for the first 18 months. They lived in it through the small, careful winter of 1995. When the boy and his aunt sat in front of the small, careful fire in the small, careful evening, with the small, careful kettle on, and the boy taught his aunt, in the small, careful slow way, how to drink a cup of tea without holding the cup with both hands, a thing that she had not done in 14 years, having held the cup with both hands in the cell on the principle that the cup was small and her hands were cold, and she did not, in the cell, have any other small, careful object that fit between her 2 palms. And his aunt taught the boy in the small, careful, slow way, the small, careful, long Lestrange family magics in their long forms, the small, careful forms that she had had at 6 on the bench in 1957 from her Aunt Drula, and which she had not in the cell been able to teach the boy because the small, careful, long forms required, by the small, careful Lestrange way, more space than a cell of 8 feet by 10 could afford, and the boy, in the small, careful Brittany cottage with the Albanian foundation, in the small, careful winter of 1995, learned the small, careful long line of no, which is the long, flat, clean, cold plane of refusal that runs the length of a corridor, and which a Lestrange of the small, careful 16th century had used in 1611 to hold off 4 duelists at once, and which the boy, on the morning of the 3rd of February, 1996, used, in the small, careful clearing, to hold off 3 small, careful black-robed figures who had come into the small, careful clearing on the trail of a rosier rumor, and who had, on the small, careful holding of the small, careful long line of no, retreated in the small, careful Death Eater way, in the small, careful early morning fog. They built the small, careful manor in 1997. They built it in the small, careful black way, on the small, careful Albanian foundation, with the small, careful Italian stone, with the small, careful French oak, with the small, careful Brittany roof, with the small, careful long garden out the back, and they planted in the small careful long garden in the small careful spring of 1998, the small careful apple trees that the boy's aunt had said, on the small careful evening of the planting, in the small careful low voice, were the small careful apple trees of the orchard at Malfoy Manor in 1979, but the small careful apple trees of the orchard at the small careful Albanian Manor in 1998, and the orchard in 1998 was not, the boy's aunt had said in the small careful low voice, going to be an orchard for the Lord, but an orchard for tea in the small careful late afternoon, with the small careful kettle on, and the small careful boy of 17 in the small careful chair, and the small careful aunt in the small careful other chair, and the small careful apple trees in the small careful long summer of the small careful clearing. They lived in the small careful manor. They lived in it through 1998 and 1999 and the long 2000, and through the small careful war that, in the small careful far country to the west, the Lord lost in the small careful late spring of 2002 in the small careful long defeat the boy had been expecting all along, by the small careful work of the small careful Hogwarts children who had been a year behind the boy in his small careful first year, and who had, in the small careful boy's small careful 7th year. In 1997, when the boy had been at the small careful Albanian Manor, and not in the small careful Lord's small careful arrangement at Hogwarts, taken the small careful work of the small careful war upon themselves and won. And the boy heard the news on the small careful evening of the 11th of May 2002, in the small careful drawing room in front of the small careful fire, by the small careful brown paper of a small clean Hufflepuff letter from a small careful Cedric Diggory, who was, in 2002, a small careful order of the small careful new ministry. The boy read the letter once, he folded it, he put it on the small careful side table, he said in his quiet voice in the small careful drawing room to his small careful aunt in the small careful chair across the fire, "Aunt Bella, he is dead, the war is over," she said, "I had heard." He said, "How?" she said, "The line goes on, Lapin. The line knows when the small careful Lord piece of the line goes out." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you well?" He said, "I am well." She said, "Are you free, Lapin?" He said in his quiet voice, "Aunt Bella, we have been free since the morning of the 25th of June, 1995. She said, "Yes." She said, "Lapin." He said, "Yes, Aunt Bella." She said, "Come and sit by me." He came. He sat on the small careful arm of the small careful chair, the way he had sat behind the bench in the cell in 1987, and his aunt put her small careful Lestrange arm around the small careful Lestrange, waist of the small careful black boy of 21, and she put her chin on the top of his head, and they sat in the small careful drawing room in front of the small careful fire in the small careful Albanian late spring evening. And the small careful clock above the fire told the small careful slow careful black hour, and the small careful kettle on the small careful range was, in the small careful kitchen, just beginning to boil. The line went on. They lived in the manor for many years. They lived in it through the small careful late 2000s, when the small careful war's small careful aftermath was, in the small careful far country to the west, slowly being healed, and they lived in it through the small careful 2010s, when the small careful new world of the small careful wizarding piece was, in the small careful far country to the west, slowly being built, and they lived in it through the small careful 2020s, when the small careful Albanian woodland was, in the small careful new century, slowly becoming a small careful new country of its own. They were, in those years, sometimes visited by the small careful elder Knot, who came up on the small careful long route by way of Wiltshire and the small careful French coast, and who sat in the small careful drawing room with the small careful boy's aunt, and who, in the small careful drawing room, was not, in the small careful Knot manner of his small careful adult years, the small careful clerk of the 3rd sub-level, but the small careful child of the back of the Slytherin common room of 1976, and the small careful boy's aunt in the small careful drawing room was not the small careful madwoman of the orchard of 1979, but the small careful black daughter of the schoolroom of 1961, on the small careful wide grey lap of her Aunt Drula, who had been in the small careful long line of the rosier women, the small careful seer of the small careful unrecorded kind, and the small careful boy, who was, by the small careful late 2010s, a small careful man of close to 40, was the small careful boy of 14 who had, in the small careful cell in the small careful morning, said to the small careful aurors in the small careful cell quiet voice, the small careful word number. She was, in 2031, 50 years old in the small careful black accounting, which, by the small careful black accounting, did not, on principle, count the years a black daughter spent in a cell, on the principle that those years were not, by the small careful black principle, hers, and the boy was, in 2031, 51 in the small careful actual accounting, and a small careful clean 36 in the small careful black accounting, and on the small careful morning of the 3rd of August, 2031, in the small careful clearing in front of the small careful manor, 3 small careful auras of the small careful new ministry came up the small careful long path, in the small careful late summer way, on the small careful errand of the small careful ministry, with the small careful purpose of taking the small careful boy, who was a small careful man now, into the small careful ministry's custody for the small careful unresolved warrant that the small careful ministry had been holding, in the small careful long way, against the small careful name Bellatrix Lestrange since 1981. The 3 small careful aurors stopped at the small careful low garden wall. The boy was in the small careful clearing. The boy was in the small careful clearing, because the boy in the small careful late summer mornings had taken to walking in the small careful long Lestrange dual form in the small careful clearing, with his small careful Lestrange hands at his sides and his head an inch lower than was expected, in the small careful slow circuit that took him, in the small careful 7 minutes of the circuit, around the small careful long garden and the small careful apple trees and the small careful low stone wall. And his aunt was on the small careful garden bench by the small careful kitchen door, in the small careful black shawl, with a small careful book in her small careful Lestrange lap. The 3 auras at the wall said, "Mr. Potter." The boy stopped in his dual form. He looked at the chin of the aura in front. He said in his cell-quiet voice, "Aura." The aura said, "Mr. Potter." By order of the ministry, he did not finish. He did not finish because the boy, in the small careful clearing, in the small careful late summer way, lifted his hand. The small starfish hand, palm flat, fingers spread. The same hand that had come up in 1982 at Holcomb's Lumos, and in 1988 at Lal Burridge's wand, and in 1991 at Dawlish's chest, and in 1995 at the Lord's chest in the graveyard at Little Hengleton. And the 3 small careful auras at the wall in the small careful late summer morning, found in the small careful order of the small careful late summer morning, their wands no longer in their hand. Their wands, in the small careful late summer morning, were on the small careful gravel by the small careful low garden wall. They were on the small careful gravel because the boy, by the small careful triple Lestrange expelliarmus that his aunt had taught him in the small careful clearing in 1998, the small careful long form, with the small careful long stare and the small careful cold breath, had taken them in the small careful single small careful moment in which his small careful right hand had come up. The boy said in the cell-quiet voice, "Auras, please, pick up your wands, go home." The auras picked up their wands. They did not, at first, go home. They stood at the wall for a long, careful moment, and they looked at the boy in the clearing, and they looked at the small, careful Lestrange dual form that he had not, on disarming them, dropped, and the senior aura said in his small, careful voice, "Mr. Potter, you will be sent for by the ministry." The boy said in the cell-quiet voice, "I am sure. When you are next sent, send me a letter. I will, on receiving it, decide what to do. Today I am at home. Today I am with my aunt. Go home." They went. They went down the small, careful long path in the small, careful late summer morning, and they got into their small, careful broom carriage at the foot of the path, and they went, in the small, careful blue-green flash of an unauthorized ministry portkey, back to the small, careful far country to the west, and the small, careful ministry, in the small, careful late summer day, sent the small, careful letter the small, careful boy had requested by the small, careful slow, by the small, careful elder not son Theodore, who was, by 2031, the small, careful minister's small, careful office's small, careful undersecretary. And the small careful letter the small careful ministry sent in the small careful late summer afternoon said, in the small careful small clean Theodore not hand, cousin, you are not to be pursued. The ministry will not in the small careful minister's small careful current administration send a second delegation. The warrant on your aunt's name has been by the small careful working of the small careful undersecretary's office on the small careful afternoon of the 3rd of August, 2031, returned to the small careful long file in the small careful Department of Mysteries. Walk carefully. The line goes on. Cousin T. The boy read it once. He folded it. He put it on the side table by the fire. He went out in the small careful late summer evening into the small careful clearing. He found his aunt on the small careful garden bench by the small careful kitchen door in the small careful black shawl with the small careful book closed in her small careful Lestrange lap. He said in the quiet voice, Aunt Bella, the ministry says we are not to be pursued. She said, I know. He said, how? She said, I have known. He said, yes. She said, Lapin, come and sit by me. He sat. He sat on the small careful garden bench in the small careful late summer evening, by his small careful aunt of 50 years in the small careful black accounting, and she put her small careful Lestrange arm around the small careful Lestrange, waist of the small careful black man of 51 in the small careful actual accounting, and the small careful sun, in the small careful late summer way, was going down across the small careful apple trees of the small careful long garden. And the small careful clearing was the small careful long clearing of the small careful end of a small careful long day. She watched him. She watched him as she had watched him on the bench in cell 14 on the 2nd of November, 1981, when the milk had come down for the first time, and she had not known what to do with him and had decided on the 4th hour that she would not, that night, kill him. And she watched him as she had watched him on the morning of the 7th of February, 1990, when the flagstone in front of the bench had cracked for the first time under his small careful Lestrange reducto, and she had laughed her glass-bright laugh for the first time since 1979, and she watched him as she had watched him on the morning of the 1st of August, 1991, in the corridor of the 2nd tier, when he had said no to the Auror Dawlish, and lifted the small starfish hand, and held the soundless reducto on his palm, and refused to leave her. And the Auror Hagrid had said, in the deep wet voice, Harry, go, son, and the boy had gone. The small careful Lestrange dual formed down the corridor, not looking back. And she watched him in the small careful late summer evening of the 3rd of August, 2031, on the small careful garden bench, as her hands on her lap opened, palms up, in the small careful black way. The open palms of a black woman opened in the small careful evening to receive the small careful blessing of the small careful black evening. She said in her low voice, the voice the cell had taught her, the voice the lullaby had been said in for 30 years behind her teeth, and which had not in those 30 years lost any of the small careful black lilt that her Aunt Drula had taught her in 1957, my beautiful boy. He said, Aunt Bella. She said, I was mad. He said, yes. She said, I was mad and you made me a mother. He said, Aunt Bella. She said, Lapin, listen, there will be others after this. The line goes on. There will be a small, careful black child in our house, in our long evening, in the small, careful long line of the small, careful Rosier Lestrange, Black Potter Revan's line. You will, in the small, careful long line, be a small, careful Aunt Bella of your own kind. You will, in the small, careful long way, do what I did in the small, careful long way for me. You will, the line knows, he said in his quiet voice. Yes, Aunt Bella, she said, the world has been very long, the world has been very small, the world has been very long for me and very small for you, and we have lived in it, Lapin, the two of us. We have lived in it the small, careful black way. He said, yes, Aunt Bella, she said, Lapin, I will go in, the evening is cold. He said, I will come with you. She said, yes. She got up from the bench. He got up from the bench. He took her small, careful Lestrange arm under his small, careful Lestrange arm, in the small, careful late summer way. And they went in the small, careful slow black step, in the small, careful clearing of the small, careful end of the small, careful day, into the small, careful house, in the small, careful Albanian woodland, in the small, careful long line of the small, careful black evening. And the small, careful door in the small, careful late summer way closed behind them, and the small, careful clearing was In the small, careful, long, late summer way, empty, and the small, careful kettle in the small, careful kitchen was just beginning to boil. The end.